Hello, my friend. However your day has gone, I'm really glad you're here. Before we disappear into another forgotten corner of history together, if these quiet stories have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel reach someone else who needs it too. It costs nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you settle in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a quiet evening in Vermont, a cosy village somewhere in Yorkshire, or a cool night just outside Adelaide with your dog asleep nearby. Leave it in the comments. I really do read every single one. Now, get comfortable. You don't have to do anything except listen. Leave today's worries where they are, and just stay here, with me. Comfortable? Good. Let us begin. Snow is falling on a valley in western Norway, drifting quietly through the still winter air. It is the last hour of a short winter afternoon, already dark enough to call it evening, and the only light for miles comes from a long timber hall nestled into the side of a snowy hillside. This is a longhouse, not the cramped, smoke-blackened hut you might be picturing, but a spacious timber hall built by people who understood exactly how to live through long northern winters. Firelight spills from the doorway each time it opens, turning the snow outside to gold for just a heartbeat before darkness quietly returns. Inside that hall is a young woman named Solveig, and she is the one whose evening we're going to follow, from the first knock on the door until the fire finally settles into embers sometime past midnight. Solveig is 19. She's the daughter of a farmer of modest but respected standing, not wealthy, not poor, the kind of family that owns its own land and its own boats, and is invited to feasts like this one because reputation in this world runs on more than silver. Tonight she's a guest in the hall of a local chieftain named Thorvald, a man whose authority in this valley rests less on force than on exactly this kind of evening, on his ability to fill a hall with meat and mead and warmth and send every guest home a little more loyal than when they arrived. Solveig has been to this hall before at midsummer, but never in winter, never for a feast like this one, and she is nervous in a way she's trying hard not to show because tonight, for the first time, she is old enough to be seated not with the children and the unmarried girls near the door, but somewhere closer to the centre of things, somewhere that matters. Here is the detail I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is the kind of thing that gets lost when we picture this world only in terms of horned helmets and longships and battle. The most powerful person in this hall tonight, the person whose judgment will decide who sits where, who drinks first, who is honoured and who is quietly, invisibly reminded of their place, is not Thorvald. It is his wife. Her name is Gunhild, and she is the lady of the house, the Husfreyja, and in a moment you're about to watch her do something that would have been instantly understood by every single person walking through that door tonight and completely invisible to an outsider who did not know what they were looking at. She's standing near the hearth in a long wool dress the colour of rust and earth, a string of glass and amber beads catching the firelight across her chest, an iron keyring at her belt that jingles faintly when she moves, and that keyring is not decoration. It is a symbol of real, formal, legal authority. Gunhild holds the keys to the storerooms. She controls the household's food, its silver, its trade goods. She decides, in ways her husband does not interfere with, what this family eats and what it gives away, and what it saves for a harder year. Tonight, that authority is on full display because tonight she is the one who will decide silently, through a ritual older than anyone in this hall can remember the origin of, exactly how honoured each guest is going to feel. The first guests are arriving now. You can hear them before you see them, voices carrying strangely in the muffled quiet that snow creates, the crunch of footsteps compacting fresh powder, a dog barking somewhere off toward the outbuildings. A servant opens the door and cold air rolls into the hall in a visible wave, carrying snow dust that swirls once in the firelight before settling. Standing in the doorway is a man Solveig recognizes, a landholder named Bjorn from 2 farms over, his wife beside him, both of them wrapped in heavy wool cloaks pinned at the shoulder with round brooches, their eyebrows and the edges of their hoods dusted white. And here is the first thing that happens, the first small rule that governs this entire evening, one that nobody in the hall would think to explain out loud because everybody already knows it, Bjorn does not simply walk in and find a seat. He waits just inside the door, cloak still on, until Gunhild crosses the hall to greet him herself. This waiting is not shyness, and it is not protocol for its own sake. It is the entire hospitality system of the Viking world compressed into 10 seconds. A guest who is not properly received has not truly entered the household's protection, and in a world where a farm's isolation in deep winter could mean real danger from exposure, from wolves, from simple bad luck on an icy path, being formally welcomed under someone's roof meant something. It meant you were now under that household's care for as long as you stayed. Gunhild reaches Bjorn and his wife, and she does not simply say hello. She offers a formal greeting, a few words about the road and the weather and how glad she is they came despite the snow, and only after that greeting is complete does she gesture for a servant to take their cloaks. The brooches are unpinned carefully. These are not cheap things. A bronze or silver cloak pin can represent real wealth, sometimes passed down through 3 generations, and there is an unspoken understanding that a good host's household will keep every guest's belongings safe through the night without needing to be asked. Once the cloaks are gone, the next thing happens, and this is the moment Solveig has been half dreading and half looking forward to all week, because this is the part where status becomes visible to everyone in the room without a single word being spoken about it. A servant girl approaches Bjorn and his wife carrying a drinking horn, a real horn, curved and pale, rimmed in worked silver filled with mead. But she does not hand it to them. She brings it first to Gunhild. This is the custom of the first horn, and it is one of the oldest and most consistent rituals we know of from Norse feasting life. Described in poems, referenced in sagas, expected by everyone in that hall tonight the way you or I would expect a host to say hello at the door of a dinner party. The lady of the house drinks first from every horn that is about to be passed, and then she is the one who personally offers it onward. It is not a servant's job to hand a guest their welcome cup. It is hers, and the order in which she offers it, the words she says as she offers it, the amount of warmth in her voice as she does it, all of that is being watched, quietly, by everyone standing near enough to see. Solveig watches Gunhild's face as she offers the horn to Bjorn's wife first before Bjorn himself, and there is a story in that small choice, something about the friendship between the two women that goes back further than tonight, though nobody says so out loud. Gunhild speaks a short verse as she does it, something about welcome and hearth and the road behind them now being behind them, the kind of half-formal, half-warm little blessing that a husfreyja is expected to have ready, sometimes composed for the occasion, sometimes traditional and worn smooth from years of repetition, and Bjorn's wife takes the horn with both hands, drinks and says something back, a small returned kindness, before passing the horn to her husband. This exchange, this entire sequence from cloak to greeting to horn to verse to answer, has taken perhaps 90 seconds. It will be repeated with small variations for every guest who arrives tonight, and Solveig understands, watching it happen for the 3rd time as more guests file in through the swirling cold at the door, that she is watching a woman conduct an enormous amount of invisible diplomatic labour while appearing to simply be gracious. Let us step back from the doorway for a moment and look at the hall itself, because you cannot understand the evening without understanding the room it happens in. The hall Thorvald built runs a full 60 feet from end to end, a single long rectangular space, its roof held up by 2 rows of internal posts running the length of the building. Thick pine trunks, some of them carved near the top with simple interlocking patterns that catch shadow strangely in firelight, making the carvings seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. The walls are timber, chinked with moss and clay against the wind, and hung in places with woven wall hangings. Not decorative in the way we might think of decoration today, but practical too, breaking drafts, holding in warmth, while also displaying the household's wealth and skill in weaving, which was itself a significant marker of a family's standing. A space this size could hold, on a night like tonight, several dozen guests at once without ever feeling crowded. Benches enough along both walls for every rank and every household the valley considered worth inviting on a night this significant. Down the centre of the hall runs a long hearth, a shallow stone-lined trench where a fire has been burning since morning and will keep burning until the last guest leaves, fed steadily by a rotation of household members whose job tonight, largely unglamorous and largely unnoticed, is to make sure it never dies down and never smokes too much, and never throws a spark far enough to catch the rushes on the floor. The smoke rises and drifts along the underside of the roof, finding its way out through a hole left near the ridge beam, and if you have never stood in a room lit only by a long fire like this, I want you to try to picture it honestly. It is not bright the way electric light is bright. It moves. Shadows lengthen and shrink with every flare and settle of the flames, and every face in the room is lit warm on one side and shadowed on the other, and there is a particular smell that settles into everything. Wood smoke and roasting meat and wet wool drying near the heat, and the animal tallow of the lamp set along the walls. A smell that would have clung to everyone's hair and clothes for days afterward, carried home quietly along with whatever else that long, generous evening gave them to remember it by. For good, for years to come. Benches line both long walls, and this brings us to the next piece of the evening's invisible architecture, because where you sit tonight is not random, and it is not first come first served, and getting it wrong, sitting somewhere above your standing, is one of the fastest ways a guest could embarrass themselves, and, more seriously, embarrass their host. The most honoured seat in the hall is the high seat, set roughly at the midpoint of one long wall, facing the hearth and the door, flanked by two carved posts that mark it as a place of authority, the way a throne might in another context, though the word throne overstates it. This is Thorvald's seat, and directly across the hearth from it, in a position that mirrors his in status, sits Gunhild's own honoured place among the women. Moving outward from the high seat in both directions, the honour of a position decreases steadily, so that the closer you sit to the centre, the more esteemed you are considered, and the further out toward the ends of the hall, nearer the door, the lower you're standing, whether that lowness comes from youth, from being a stranger not yet proven, or simply from custom regarding your family's history with the household. Solveig, tonight, has been placed closer to the centre than she has ever sat before, and she notices it immediately, the small shift in where she is directed to sit compared to midsummer, and she understands without anyone explaining it that this is Gunhild's doing, a quiet acknowledgement that Solveig's family has done something right in the past year, perhaps a good trade, perhaps simply steady, reliable friendship, and that this small movement of a few feet along a wooden bench is itself a kind of message being sent to everyone else in the hall who knows how to read it. Nobody announces these placements. There is no seating chart pinned to the door. And yet every single guest, from the oldest farmer to the youngest child old enough to be included, understands the map of the room the moment they walk in, understands it the way you might understand, without being told, which chair at a family dinner belongs to your grandfather and which one you would never dream of taking. More guests arrive, and here is where the evening starts to widen out from that one doorway into the fuller life of the hall. A boy of perhaps 12 slips in with his parents, wide-eyed at the noise and warmth after the walk through the dark, and he goes immediately to stand near the hearth, close enough that an older man swats him lightly away from the worst of the heat, with a laugh that is not unkind. Children are present tonight, and this matters, because a Viking feast was rarely an adults-only affair the way we might picture a modern formal dinner party. Whole families came together, generations mixed on the same benches, grandparents and infants and everyone between, and the boundary between the feast as celebration and the feast as ordinary household life was thinner than you might expect. The children would eventually be sent, sleepy and full, to nestle among furs near the walls while the adults talked on, but for now they are underfoot, curious, occasionally useful, sent on small errands by servants grateful for extra hands. A dog moves along the base of the benches, working the floor for anything dropped, and nobody minds it. The floor itself is covered in rushes, dried reeds and straw scattered thick enough to soak up spills and soften the packed earth beneath, and it will be swept out and replaced after tonight. The old rushes carrying with them the accumulated evidence of the evening, spilled mead, dropped bones, melted snow tracked in from outside. Now, something is happening near the hearth that Solveig watches with real interest, because it touches one of those unwritten rules that trips up outsiders every single time, though nobody in this hall would think to call it a rule at all. A servant is carrying a tray of bread toward one of the tables, and before setting it down, she breaks the first loaf and offers the first piece, not to the nearest guest, and not even to the most obviously important guest at that particular table, but to the eldest person seated there, an elderly woman with silver hair and a face lined deep from decades of wind and weather. This is a small thing. It happens in about 2 seconds, and most people in the hall are not even watching it happen. But it reflects something real about how this world organized respect, layering age alongside rank, alongside gender in ways that shifted depending on the specific moment, so that a young chieftain might hold formal authority in the hall, while still deferring, automatically and without thinking twice, to an elder's claim to be served first at the table. Solveig's own grandmother, long dead now, used to say that a hall which forgot its elders would not keep its luck long, and Solveig thinks of her, briefly, watching the old woman accept the bread with a small nod that carries its own quiet authority. The tables themselves are being filled now, long boards set on trestles, not permanent furniture but assembled fresh for occasions like this one, and taken apart again after, cleared away to leave the hall open for daily life. And the food arriving on them is worth slowing down for, because this is not simple food, not the thin gruel and hard bread that formed the daily diet of most households through the leanest parts of winter. Tonight the household has spent weeks preparing, and it shows. There is roasted pork, the fat crackling audibly as a servant carries the platter past close enough for Solveig to feel the heat radiating off it. There is smoked fish, herring and salmon cured over birch smoke months earlier and saved specifically for occasions like this one. There are round loaves of dark bread, dense with barley and rye, still warm enough that steam rises faintly when one is broken open. There are wheels of cheese, pale and firm, set out alongside crocks of butter churned that same week. Dried apples and preserved berries, gathered in autumn and kept through the cold months in careful storage, appear in small wooden bowls passed hand to hand down the tables. And here is a detail that surprises people every time I mention it. Drinking vessels tonight are not identical. A guest's status is visible even in what they drink from. The most honoured guests, seated nearest the high seat, are given horns rimmed in silver or bronze, sometimes carved along their length with simple patterns, while guests further down the hall drink from plainer horns, or from wooden cups turned on a lathe, sturdy and handsome in their own right but unmistakably a step below the metal-rimmed vessels closer to the centre. Nobody comments on this. Nobody needs to. The hierarchy sits there quietly in the shape of the cup in your hand, and everyone reads it without a flicker of surprise, the way you might glance at a table setting today and know, instantly without being told, which fork is for the salad and which is for the main course, except here the stakes run deeper, because the cup is not about etiquette for its own sake. It is a public, visible record of where you stand in this household's regard. Thorvald has taken his place in the high seat now, and the hall's attention gathers toward him the way iron filings gather toward a magnet, not urgently, not with any dramatic hush, but with a kind of settling, voices lowering slightly, benches shifting as people turn a little more toward the center of the room. He stands, horn in hand, and calls for the first formal toast of the evening, a skål, and here is where I want to slow down, because the word skål gets thrown around today as a kind of generic cheers, and it is worth knowing what it actually meant in a hall like this one. A toast in this world was not casual. It was structured, sequential, and deeply meaningful, and it followed an order that everyone present understood instinctively. The first toast of the evening was almost always raised to Odin, or to whichever god the household held closest, a request for luck and protection woven into the act of drinking itself. The second toast in many households went to the memory of ancestors, a formal act of remembering the dead who had built the household's fortune and whose reputation the living were now responsible for upholding. Only after these toasts were made would the evening move into toasts of a more personal kind, toasts to guests, to alliances, to the harvest just past, or the one hoped for in spring. Thorvald's toast tonight begins with Odin, his voice pitched to carry the length of the hall without shouting, and when he finishes, every horn in the room rises together, and the sound of nearly 40 people drinking at once is oddly gentle, more a soft communal exhale than anything sharp or celebratory. Solveig drinks when the horn reaches her, mead thick and sweet and warm from being kept near the fire, and she notices, as she has noticed at every feast she has attended since she was old enough to pay attention, that nobody drinks alone. The horn moves. It is shared, passed from hand to hand down a bench, and the sharing of a single vessel among several people was not born of scarcity, though scarcity clearly shaped plenty of Viking domestic life. It was deliberate. Drinking from a shared cup was itself a small act of trust, a physical demonstration that you belonged to the same circle as the person who drank before you and the person who would drink after. Now something shifts in the room's rhythm, and it is worth pausing on because it illustrates just how many small customs are stacked on top of each other in an evening like this one, without a single person in the hall needing to think consciously about any of them. A guest near the far end of the hall, a young man Solveig does not recognize, reaches for a piece of bread before the elder at his table has been served. It is a small mistake. Nobody shouts, nobody corrects him loudly. But Solveig sees the servant pause, sees the elder's mouth tighten very slightly, sees the young man's own father lean over and murmur something low enough that only his son can hear, and the young man's ears go red, and he sets the bread back down and waits. This is how so much of the etiquette in this hall functions, not through spoken law, but through this kind of instant, quiet social correction, absorbed early in life and carried forward without needing to be actively remembered, the same way you or I might instinctively lower our voice in a library without anyone posting a sign to tell us to. Let me tell you about the food itself now, because we have talked around it and it deserves its own attention. The eating at a feast like this did not happen in courses the way a modern dinner does, with soup arriving and disappearing before the main plate comes out. Instead, food arrived in waves and stayed, platters replenished as they emptied, so that the tables in front of Solveig and her neighbours are, by this point in the evening, a kind of continuous shifting landscape of meat and bread and cheese, some dishes new and steaming, others sitting half-finished while conversation takes precedence over eating for a stretch. The pork Solveig tastes has been roasted over the same long hearth that lights the hall, turned on a spit for hours by a rotation of kitchen servants whose forearms will ache tomorrow from the effort. The skin crackled dark, and the meat beneath it falling away from the bone with almost no resistance. Beside it, a stew simmers in a large iron cauldron suspended over a portion of the fire. Root vegetables and barley and chunks of mutton, thickened slow over hours, the kind of dish that asks nothing of the cook except patience. There is a particular Norse instinct, worth mentioning here, toward using nearly everything a slaughtered animal provided, not from some abstract principle of sustainability as we might frame it today, but from the plain hard economics of a world where a farm's entire winter survival could hinge on how efficiently autumn's harvest and slaughter were used. Blood sausage appears on one platter, dark and dense, seasoned with herbs. Organ meats, prepared carefully, sit alongside the more familiar cuts. Nothing here reads as strange or unappetizing to anyone in the hall tonight. It is simply food, prepared by people who understood their ingredients completely, and Solveig eats a piece of the blood sausage without a second thought, the way you might reach for a slice of bread without considering its origins. Drinking continues alongside the eating, mead in the horns closest to the high seat, ale further down the hall, the more common daily drink for households that could not always spare the honey required for mead in large quantities. And here is something that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. This ale was often thick, almost soup-like by modern standards, brewed dark and heavy, sometimes flavoured with herbs like bog myrtle or juniper before hops became the dominant flavouring choice centuries later. It was also, critically, often safer to drink than the water available, since the brewing process killed off many of the pathogens that could make untreated water dangerous, which meant that ale in a household like Thorvald's was not simply a pleasure, but, in its own quiet way, a matter of basic health, consumed by adults, and in smaller and weaker portions, sometimes even by children. A servant approaches Gunhild's honoured seat, now carrying a tray of small carved wooden items, and Solveig watches with interest as Gunhild selects 2 small brooches worked in bronze, and has them carried down to a young married couple seated part way along the hall, guests who arrived somewhat later than most. their farm evidently a longer walk from Thorvald's hall than the others. This is gift-giving, and it is not incidental to the feast, it is structural to it. One of the load-bearing pillars of the entire social system this evening exists to maintain. A chieftain's household that hosted lavishly but gave nothing away would be seen in this world as hoarding, as failing in one of the central obligations of power, because generosity was not a virtue layered on top of status in Viking society. It was largely how status was measured in the first place. A man's or woman's reputation, their standing among neighbours and rivals alike, rested heavily on stories of their open-handedness, their willingness to share what they had, their refusal to let a guest leave a hall feeling smaller than when they arrived. The sagas are full of this, full of praise for generous chieftains and quiet contempt for stingy ones. And Thorvald, watching his wife send those brooches down the hall, nods almost imperceptibly, satisfied, because every gift Gunhild gives tonight is also in its way an investment in his own name. Solveig's own father received a small iron knife at midsummer, a gift he still carries and still mentions, months later, with a kind of quiet pride that has nothing to do with the knife's actual monetary value, and everything to do with what it represents, a public acknowledgement that Thorvald's household considers him worth remembering. This is honour culture in its most concrete form, not an abstraction, not a poetic idea, but small physical objects moving from hand to hand, each one a tiny permanent record of a relationship, carried home and kept, and occasionally shown to a neighbour with the story of how it was earned. Now something changes in the room. The eating has slowed, plates and platters settling into that comfortable half-finished state that marks the shift from a meal's beginning toward its middle hours, and a man rises from a bench near the hearth, and the quality of the room's attention changes instantly, the way a theatre goes quiet when the house lights dim, except nobody here has announced anything. This is Eirik, and he is the skald, the household's poet, a role that carried genuine weight in Norse society, closer in function to a historian and a diplomat and an entertainer all folded into one person than to anything we might casually call an entertainer today. A good skald was valuable enough that chieftains competed to keep them in their households, because a skald's verses were how reputation travelled, how a chieftain's deeds were remembered after the deeds themselves were forgotten by everyone who witnessed them firsthand. Eirik does not simply start talking. There is a small ritual to this too, a brief silence he lets sit in the room, letting every conversation wind down naturally rather than demanding quiet, and Solveig finds herself leaning forward slightly, the way she always does when a skald begins, because there is something genuinely magnetic about watching someone compose or recite complex poetry from memory, live, in a room full of people who will remember every word wrong if he gets it wrong. Tonight he chooses a poem about a sea voyage, not one of Thorvald's own exploits, but an older piece, one that has been passed down and reworked across generations, the kind of poem everyone in the hall has heard some version of before, and yet still leans in to hear again, the way you might listen to a familiar song and still feel something new in it depending on the night. The verse form itself is intricate in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate unless you understand the structure, dense with alliteration, with kennings, those compressed poetic riddles that stand in for ordinary nouns, so that the sea might be called the whale road and blood might be called the wound's due, phrases that force the listener to actively decode the image rather than simply receive it. This is not simple entertainment. It is closer to a shared intellectual performance, the room actively participating in the meaning-making, even while sitting perfectly still. I want to be honest with you about something here. It is easy, when people talk about the Viking world, to reach immediately for the drama, for raids and longships and battle, and there is a place for that history, no question, but it tends to crowd out something that mattered just as much to the people actually living in these halls, which is how much they valued language itself, how much status accrued to a person who could turn a phrase well, how central memory and story and careful, patient craft with words were to an entire culture that we too often reduce to violence in the popular imagination. Eirik's poem tonight will be retold in fragments by people who heard it for months, maybe years, and some tiny piece of tonight, this snowy hall, this fire, will travel outward through that retelling long after the specific evening itself is forgotten. When the poem ends, the hall does not erupt into applause the way a modern audience might. Instead, there is a low murmur of appreciation, someone striking the flat of their hand against a bench a few times, a general loosening of posture, and Thorvald himself calls out a word of praise that carries the specific weight of a chieftain publicly endorsing his skald's skill in front of the entire hall, which matters because Eric's own reputation, his own future prospects in other households, should he ever choose to leave, rest partly on moments exactly like this one. Music follows, not as a separate scheduled event, but simply flowing out of the space the poem has left behind. A man near the far wall lifting a lyre, an instrument strung with gut and shaped from a single piece of wood. It sounds softer and stranger to modern ears than you might expect. Not loud, not meant to fill a concert hall, but meant for exactly this kind of intimate gathering, where the music has to compete only with low conversation and the crackle of the fire, rather than with any real distance. A second voice joins, someone singing, and a few of the younger guests begin, almost without deciding to, a simple rhythmic clapping, not quite dancing, more a kind of communal swaying that space and dignity in the hall does not fully allow to become anything larger, though Solveig has heard that at larger gatherings, at midsummer especially, actual dancing does happen, circles forming near the hearth, movements passed down through families the same way the songs themselves are passed down. Let us slow down here for a moment, because I want to talk about something that gets flattened almost every time this period is discussed, and that is the actual, lived role of women in a hall like this one, a role that had almost nothing to do with the meek, background figure so many popular depictions default to. Gunhild is not a decorative presence tonight. She has been, since the first guest arrived, functioning as the hall's chief diplomat, its social memory, its resource manager, and its ceremonial authority, and none of that stopped the moment the greetings ended at the door. Right now, deep into the evening, she is moving quietly between clusters of guests, and Solveig watches her pause at one table, long enough to settle what looks like a small disagreement between two older men about a shared boundary line between their farms, her voice low, a joke offered at exactly the right moment to let both men save face and step back from whatever tension had been building. This was not incidental to her role, it was central to it. The lady of a household like this one managed disputes, managed alliances, managed the literal keys to the family's wealth, as we discussed earlier, and in the absence of her husband, whether he was away trading, raiding, or simply out working the land, she held full legal authority over the household, its property, and its decisions. Norse law, preserved for us in later written codes, granted women rights that would surprise people who assume the medieval world was uniformly restrictive toward women, regardless of culture or region. A woman could own property in her own right. She could initiate divorce under specific and recognized conditions, and if she did, she generally retained her dowry and often additional compensation besides. She could, and often did, run a farm entirely on her own during long stretches when her husband was elsewhere, making every decision about planting and slaughter and trade that the household's survival depended on. None of this means the world was equal in the way we might use that word today. It was not. Men held most formal positions of public political and military authority, and the sagas, when they survive, were mostly written by and about men. But within the household itself, and the household was the actual centre of most people's daily lives in this world, far more than any distant political assembly, women like Gunhild held real, consequential, and widely respected power, and a feast like tonight's makes that power visible in ways that a simple description could never quite capture. Every guest in this hall walking in, waited for Gunhild specifically, was served the first horn by Gunhild specifically, will leave tonight carrying an impression of the household that Gunhild specifically has spent the entire evening carefully constructing. There is a girl near Gunhild's seat, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, one of Thorvald and Gunhild's own daughters, watching her mother move through the hall with the kind of close, quiet attention children pay to the adults whose lives they are already, without quite realizing it, beginning to rehearse for themselves. She will, someday, if the pattern of this world holds, run a household of her own, and evenings exactly like this one, watched from the edges tonight, are how that knowledge gets passed down, not through any formal instruction, but through years of simply being present, absorbing the shape of it, the rhythm. The 1,000 tiny decisions that make a feast like this one feel effortless to a guest, while representing, underneath, an enormous quiet labor that nobody claps for and everybody depends on. The fire has been fed again, someone laying 2 new logs across the coals with the ease of long practice, and for a moment sparks lift and scatter along the underside of the roof before fading into the dark up near the smoke hole where snow, Solveig imagines, is probably still falling steadily onto the turf above them, silent and endless, sealing the hall in against the rest of the world. She finds herself thinking, not for the first time tonight, about how strange it is that a room this warm, this full of light and voices and the smell of roasted meat, exists at all in the middle of a valley this cold and this dark, held together by nothing more than timber and turf and the accumulated skill of people who have been building halls like this one for generations. Somewhere past the midpoint of the evening now, the room has settled into a different rhythm than it held at the start. The arrivals have stopped. Every guest who is coming tonight has come, cloaks all hung, horns all filled at least once, and the hall has that particular quality that a gathering takes on once everyone has arrived and there is nothing left to wait for, a kind of settled ease spreading bench to bench. Conversation has broken into smaller clusters now, rather than orbiting the center of the room the way it did during the toasts and the poem. And this is where I want to take you into some of the smaller, quieter customs, the ones that rarely make it into popular retellings of this period, because they lack the drama of a formal toast or the spectacle of a scold's performance, but which shape daily interaction just as thoroughly. There is, for instance, a specific and widely understood etiquette around how long a guest is expected to stay engaged with the host's table before it becomes acceptable to drift toward more casual conversation elsewhere in the hall. Leaving too early, moving away from the center before a certain unspoken threshold has passed, could read as a subtle insult, a suggestion that the host's company or hospitality was not quite worth lingering over. Solveig's own mother taught her this the hard way once, years ago at a smaller gathering, gently steering her back toward the center of a room when she had wandered off too soon to play with other children, murmuring that it was not yet time. Tonight, that threshold has clearly passed. Guests are moving freely now, some drifting toward the door end of the hall to talk with old friends, others staying close to the fire simply because the fire is warm and the conversation there is good. An old man near Solveig's bench is telling a story to a small cluster of listeners, not a formal saga recitation like Eric's poem earlier, but something more casual, a personal account of a trading voyage he made decades ago, embellished almost surely in places, the way any story told often enough over the years tends to accumulate small improvements with each telling. Nobody minds the embellishment. There is an understood difference in this culture between the formal, careful, memory-bound accuracy expected of a skald reciting inherited verse, and the looser, warmer license granted to an old man telling his own life's adventures by the fire, and everyone in the small circle around him leans into the story exactly the way you might lean into a favourite relative's well-worn tale at a holiday table, half for the story itself and half for the simple comfort of hearing it again in a familiar voice. Winter itself sits at the centre of tonight's gathering in a way that deserves its own attention, because this feast is not simply a feast that happens to occur in winter, it is in its structure and its purpose, a winter feast specifically tied to the deep cultural importance the Norse world placed on marking the turning of the dark season. Midwinter gatherings like this one, sometimes connected to what later sources call Yule, served a function that went beyond simple celebration. They were an act of communal reassurance in the middle of the year's hardest stretch, a way of confirming out loud and through shared food and shared fire that the community would make it through to spring together. The generosity on display tonight, the meat that has been saved specifically for this occasion, the mead poured freely rather than rationed, carries a slightly different emotional weight than a summer feast might, because everyone in this hall understands, without needing it said aloud, that they are gathered in the hardest, darkest, coldest stretch of the year, and that gathering itself, the simple physical act of many households coming together under one roof, was itself a kind of insurance, a reinforcement of the bonds that would matter enormously if any single farm ran short of stores before spring arrived. There is also, tied to this season, a quieter thread of belief running underneath tonight's warmth. References made only obliquely, in passing, the kind of thing mentioned once and then left alone rather than dwelt on, about the thinness of the boundary between the living world and other things during this darkest stretch of the year. An older woman near the hearth murmurs something to a neighbour about leaving a portion of tonight's meal outside the door before the household sleeps. An old habit, she says, her grandmother's habit, and her neighbour nods without needing more explanation. Solveig has heard fragments like this her whole life, never fully explained, never treated as urgent or frightening, simply present, the way certain small superstitions linger in any family regardless of how strictly anyone actually believes them, carried forward more out of respect for the people who carried them before than out of genuine present conviction. Let us talk now about honour and reputation more directly, because it is the current running underneath nearly everything that has happened in this hall tonight, even the smallest gestures, even the placement of a wooden bowl. In a world without banks, without any of the institutional structures we take for granted today for enforcing agreements or protecting property, reputation functioned as something close to a currency in its own right, and a person's word once given carried weight precisely because there was so little else standing behind it besides the community's collective memory and collective judgment. A man who broke his word, who failed to repay a debt, who treated a guest poorly, could not simply move to another valley and start fresh with a clean reputation. Not easily, because news travelled along exactly the kinds of social networks that a feast like tonight's exists to maintain and strengthen. Word of a stingy host, a host who let guests go hungry, or who insulted them through poor seating or coldness, would travel from this hall outward through every guest who leaves tonight, reaching farms and halls these particular guests will visit in the coming months, and Thorvald's standing among his neighbours depends, in very concrete terms, on tonight going well. This is why the details we have walked through, the first horn, the seating by rank, the gifts sent down the hall, the careful attention paid to elders, none of it is arbitrary decoration on top of the real business of the evening. It is the real business of the evening. Hospitality in this culture functioned as an ongoing, high-stakes performance of trustworthiness, generosity, and social competence, evaluated constantly by everyone present, and a chieftain who failed at it, even in small ways, was failing at one of the central functions of leadership itself. The sagas that survive from this period are full of exactly this kind of evaluation, halls remembered for generations as places of extraordinary generosity, and other halls remembered, just as long, for stinginess or rudeness that cost a family's standing for a generation or more. Solveig thinks about her own family's modest table at home, nothing like the scale of tonight's feast, but run on exactly the same underlying principles. Her mother's insistence that a guest, any guest, even an unexpected one arriving hungry and unannounced, be fed the best the house could offer before anyone asked what brought them. Her father's careful attention to repaying every debt, every borrowed tool, every shared catch from the sea, promptly and a little more generously than strictly required. These are not separate values from the ones on display tonight in Thorvald's Grand Hall. They are the same values, scaled up, and watching Gunhild move through her enormous evening of guests, Solveig understands, more clearly than she has before, that she is watching an amplified, more elaborate version of exactly what she has been taught her whole life at her own family's much smaller table. The fire needs feeding again, and this time it is Solveig herself who is asked. A servant catching her eye and gesturing toward the wood stacked near the wall, a small and unglamorous task, and she rises without hesitation, glad, honestly, to have something to do with her hands after so long simply sitting and watching and listening. Carrying 2 lengths of birch toward the hearth, she passes close enough to the high seat to hear a fragment of the conversation happening there. Thorvald deep in discussion with an older guest about a disputed grazing boundary between 2 farms further up the valley, his voice patient, his questions careful, and she realizes that even here, even now, deep into an evening that looks, from a distance, like pure celebration, real business is being conducted. Real decisions shaping real lives are happening quietly at the edges of the fun, because a feast like this one was never only entertainment. It was governance too, informal and unhurried but genuine, the kind of quiet, relationship-based diplomacy that held together a society without the formal institutions we might expect to see doing that work today. She sets the wood carefully at the fire's edge for the next person tending it, and returns to her seat. And as she sits, an older woman beside her, someone Solveig does not know well but recognizes as a distant cousin of Gunhild's, leans over and asks her kindly about her family's autumn slaughter, how many animals, how the hay held out, ordinary practical questions that carry, underneath their ordinariness, a real interest, a real weaving together of one household's fortunes with another's. Solveig answers honestly, describing a decent autumn, not an abundant one, and the older woman nods and mentions, almost in passing, that her own son has a spare length of good rope he would be glad to trade if Solveig's father ever needs it. And just like that, without any formal negotiation, without any of the ceremony that marked the evening's larger rituals, a small thread of practical alliance has been extended between two households, exactly the kind of quiet, accumulating connection that a feast like this one exists to generate, dozens of times over, in a single long evening, most of it far too small and far too ordinary to ever appear in any saga, but no less real for that. I want to go back for a moment to something we touched on earlier and did not finish, which is the clothing itself, because there is a wealth of detail here that tends to get flattened in popular imagination down to a single generic image of fur and leather, when the reality was considerably more specific and considerably more interesting. The wool that makes up most of what Solveig and everyone else in this hall is wearing tonight was not simple by any measure. Norse wool textiles, particularly a dense warp-weighted woven wool called vadmal, represented a genuinely enormous amount of labour, from the shearing of the sheep, through the cleaning and carding of the raw fleece, through the spinning of thread on a hand spindle, a task that could occupy a woman's hands for literal years of cumulative time across a lifetime, through the weaving itself on an upright loom that stood against the wall of most households, its warp threads weighted with stone or clay loom weights that archaeologists still find scattered across excavated farm sites today. A single good wool garment, dyed and finished, might represent months of someone's labour, and the quality and dye of a garment worn to a feast like tonight said something real about the household's wealth and the skill of its women, since weaving and dyeing fell almost entirely within women's domain of work and expertise. The dyes themselves came from what the land offered. A deep, rich red might come from the roots of certain plants painstakingly gathered and processed. A soft yellow could come from local lichens. A blue, harder and more expensive to produce well, came from woad, imported in some regions, or grown carefully in others, and a garment dyed a strong, even blue represented real wealth, since achieving a deep, consistent blue took considerably more skill and more material than a paler, patchier version of the same colour. Solveig's own dress tonight is a warm, undyed brown, practical and perfectly respectable, while Gunhild's dress carries a much richer red along its trim, a small, immediately legible signal of the difference in their household's resources, read instantly by everyone in the hall, the same way we might read the difference between two different cars parked outside a modern gathering. Beneath the outer wool dresses, both women wear a linen underdress, lighter and softer against the skin, and linen itself, imported or grown and processed locally depending on the region, represented another whole category of skilled labour and trade, since flax had to be grown, harvested, retted in water for weeks to loosen the fibres, then beaten and combed and spun before it could ever become thread. Nothing about what anyone in this hall is wearing tonight arrived easily. Every garment on every body in this room represents weeks or months of accumulated, skilled, mostly female labour, and there is something worth sitting with in that thought, the way an entire evening's worth of visible status, warmth and beauty rests so completely on work that would never be written into any saga, never be sung about by any skald, and yet without which none of tonight's warmth or colour or dignity would exist at all. The men's clothing follows its own logic. Tunics of wool over linen shirts, trousers cross-gartered at the shin with woven bands, and several of the wealthier men tonight wear a short cloak even indoors, thrown back over one shoulder, fastened with a brooch, less for warmth at this point in the evening and more as a continued, quiet display. The same impulse that might lead someone today to keep a well-cut jacket on at a party, rather than tossing it aside the moment they arrive. Jewellery moves through the hall on both men and women, arm rings of silver or bronze, often given as gifts of exactly the kind Gunhild distributed earlier, functioning simultaneously as decoration, as a portable, wearable form of wealth that could, if truly necessary, be cut apart and used as currency, and as a visible record of relationships and debts of honour, since a particularly fine arm ring often carried its own remembered history, its own story of who gave it to whom and why. Table manners tonight follow their own quiet logic too, distinct enough from anything modern that a visitor dropped suddenly into this hall would trip over them within minutes without meaning to cause any offence at all. Knives are personal. Every adult at this feast carries their own, a small, well-kept blade worn at the belt, used for cutting meat from the bone and for nearly every other cutting task the meal requires, and offering to lend or, worse, borrowing someone else's knife without invitation would read as a strange and faintly presumptuous request, since a knife in this world was as personal an item as a toothbrush might be considered today. Fingers do the rest of the work that a knife cannot, and there is no shame whatsoever in eating with your hands here. No fork exists yet in this world to make the practice seem improper, though there is still a clear, understood difference between eating with the unhurried, careful manners expected at a formal feast like tonight's, and the quicker, rougher eating of an ordinary working day at home. Bones are dropped to the floor rushes rather than set aside on any kind of plate, which is precisely why the dog Solveig noticed earlier moves so purposefully along the base of the benches, and this is not considered messy or improper in the way it might read to modern eyes accustomed to different standards. It is simply how a meal like this proceeds, practical and unbothered, the floor itself functioning as a kind of communal, temporary receptacle that will be swept clean the next morning. Sharing is constant and expected. A bowl of stew set between 2 or 3 people is dipped into by all of them in turn, rather than portioned out individually, and bread is torn rather than cut, passed hand to hand down the table, each person tearing off what they need before passing the rest along. There is an expectation too around moderation that surprises people who assume, based on popular stereotype, that a Viking feast meant simple, uncomplicated excess in food and drink alike. While the mead and ale flow freely enough tonight, and while the meal is generous by any standard, there remained real social value placed on a guest who drank well without losing composure, who could hold their portion of mead through hours of toasting without becoming loud or careless or, worse, quarrelsome. A guest who drank too much, who let strong drink loosen their tongue into insult or their judgment into poor behaviour, could undo in a single evening a reputation built over years. And Solveig has heard her father mention, more than once, a neighbour 2 valleys over whose name still carries a certain quiet weight of embarrassment from a feast years before Solveig was even born, a single bad evening still remembered and still occasionally, gently brought up. The hall has grown noticeably warmer as the evening has worn on, bodies and firelight combining against the cold outside, and several of the older guests have loosened the collars of their tunics, faces ruddy from heat and mead both. Somewhere behind Solveig, 2 men are deep in an argument that sounds, from its tone, considerably more serious than it actually is, the particular kind of loud, theatrical disagreement that develops between old friends who enjoy the sport of arguing more than they actually disagree, something about whose boat handled better in last autumn's storm, and every few sentences one of them breaks into a laugh that undercuts whatever fierce point he was just making. Eric the Skald has risen again, drawn back to his feet by a few calls from guests wanting another poem, and this time he offers something shorter, lighter, a verse with a clear comic turn at its end that lands well enough that even Thorvald, usually composed in his high seat, laughs outright, a full, unguarded sound that ripples appreciation down the hall. This detail matters, I think, because it is easy, discussing a culture this formal and this ritualized, to lose sight of how formality and genuine easy warmth were not in any tension with each other here. The careful hierarchy of seats and horns and gifts existed alongside real laughter, real friendship, real teasing between people who had known each other their whole lives, the structure providing a stable container within which actual, unguarded human connection could happen freely rather than the structure existing in place of that connection. There is a particular kind of quiet that begins to settle over certain corners of the hall, even while other corners stay loud and bright. And I think this is one of the truest things about a long feast like this one, the way it does not move as a single unified mood from beginning to end, but instead fractures gently into a dozen smaller moods happening simultaneously along the length of the same room. Near the door, where the younger unmarried guests and the older children have gathered, the energy is still bright, still restless, a game involving carved bone pieces laid out on a wooden board, drawing a small crowd of onlookers who call out advice the players mostly ignore. Nearer the hearth, among the eldest guests, the conversation has slowed into something closer to companionable silence, punctuated occasionally by a low remark, long comfortable pauses between sentences that would feel to a stranger almost like awkwardness, but which Solveig recognizes instantly as the particular ease of people who have known each other for decades and no longer need constant talk to feel connected. Gunhild has finally, for the first time all evening, taken her own seat and stayed in it for more than a few minutes at a stretch, and Solveig watches her accept a horn from a servant, drink from it herself this time without the ritual weight of offering it onward first, a small, human moment of a woman finally, briefly, tending to her own comfort after hours spent tending to everyone else's. Thorvald leans toward her from the high seat and says something low that makes her laugh, a real laugh, looser than any of the formal warmth she has extended to guests all evening, and there is something quietly moving about watching the two people who have spent the whole night performing the enormous, exacting choreography of hosting simply, for a moment, be a married couple sitting together by a fire. The younger children have mostly been gathered now toward the walls, tucked into furs and cloaks in the spaces between benches and timber, some already asleep, worn out by the noise and the heat and the late hour, their small chests rising and falling in the particular deep, unguarded sleep that only children seem able to find in the middle of a loud, crowded room. A woman moves among them periodically, checking a blanket here, tucking a stray arm back under a fur there, the kind of quiet, unglamorous vigilance that keeps a household running underneath whatever celebration is happening on top of it. Outside, though nobody in the hall can see it directly, the snow has finally begun to ease, the heavy straight fall of earlier in the evening thinning now into something lighter, more scattered, single flakes catching what little light escapes through the smoke hole and the cracks around the door before disappearing into the dark. The temperature outside has continued to drop as the night deepens, the particular hard, clean cold of a clear winter night beginning to assert itself as the cloud cover that brought the snow starts to break apart, and somewhere far off, faint enough that only the sharpest ears in the hall might catch it over the noise inside, a fox calls out in the dark, an answer coming a moment later from somewhere further up the valley. Solveig has eaten more than she meant to, the way you do at a feast like this, where food keeps arriving in small unhurried waves rather than all at once, and she finds herself sitting back slightly, comfortable in a way that has as much to do with the warmth and the company as with the food itself, watching the room the way you might watch a fire, not for any particular reason, just because it is pleasant to watch, endlessly shifting, endlessly interesting in its small variations, sparks lifting here, a log settling there, the shape of the flame reshaping itself moment to moment without ever quite repeating. An older man near her, someone she recognizes now as her father's second cousin, asks her kindly whether she has been promised to anyone yet, the kind of question that in this world carries none of the awkwardness it might carry today, since marriage in Norse society functioned as a serious, practical alliance between families, negotiated carefully by parents on both sides, involving real property, real dowries, real long-term calculation about which households would benefit from being joined together. Solveig answers honestly that no arrangement has yet been made, and the old man nods, unbothered, and mentions, almost as an aside, a family further down the coast with a son of good reputation and decent land. The kind of comment that in this world functions less as gossip and more as the ordinary, practical circulation of useful information, the marriage market operating quietly underneath the surface of an evening like this one, the same way trade and alliance and reputation all operate underneath it, none of it separate from the feast's real purpose, all of it woven into the same evening. I want to talk for a moment about the sounds of this hall, because sound is one of those things that gets lost almost entirely when history is written down, and yet it shaped every single minute of an evening like this one as thoroughly as anything visual did. There is the fire itself, a constant low presence beneath everything else, popping occasionally when a knot of resin catches, a soft steady roar when a fresh log first takes. There is the particular creak of the wooden benches shifting under weight as people lean and settle and rise. There is the low murmur of dozens of overlapping conversations, no single one distinct unless you are close enough to be part of it, blending instead into something closer to a single continuous hum, rising and falling as the evening's energy rises and falls. There is the clink, softer than you might expect, of horn against horn during a toast, and the wetter, more organic sound of mead or ale being poured from a jug into a waiting cup. There is, further off, the muffled sound of the wind picking up again outside, pressing gently against the timber walls, finding whatever small gaps the moss and clay chinking has not quite sealed. And underneath it all, a smell that I mentioned earlier but want to return to now that the evening has gone on long enough for it to have deepened and settled into something almost physical, wood smoke thick enough to taste faintly at the back of the throat, roasted meat and its rendered fat, the yeasty warmth of bread, the mineral tang of spilled ale soaking slowly into the rushes underfoot, wet wool drying near the fire giving off its own particular animal warmth, and beneath all of that, faint but present, the tallow smoke of the lamps burning along the walls, a smell that Solveig associates so completely with evenings like this one that she suspects, though she has never quite put it into words before tonight, that she will spend the rest of her life catching a stray hint of tallow smoke somewhere and being pulled instantly back to exactly this feeling, this room, this particular kind of warmth. A servant moves past carrying a fresh jug of mead toward the high seat, and Solveig notices, not for the first time tonight, the particular skill required simply to keep a feast like this one running smoothly for hour after hour, a skill that receives almost none of the credit or attention that the more visible parts of the evening receive. Someone has been tending that hearth continuously since before dawn. Someone spent the better part of a week preparing the food now spread across these tables. Someone brewed the ale months ago and judged it ready. Someone wove the wall hangings that soften these timber walls and hold in this warmth. None of these people will be remembered by name in any story told about tonight, and yet without every single one of them, none of what is happening in this hall right now would be possible. Thorvald rises again, and the hall's attention gathers toward him once more. Another toast forming, this one more personal than the earlier formal ones, a toast to a good harvest just past, and, with a small, deliberately light joke, to an even better one hoped for in the year ahead, and horns rise again down the length of the hall, and Solveig drinks, mead warm and sweet, and feels, for a moment, something close to pure contentment, the specific, uncomplicated kind that arrives sometimes late in a long, warm evening among people you trust, when the cold outside has become something almost abstract, a fact you know rather than a thing you feel, and the fire and the food and the voices around you have become, for this stretch of hours at least, the entire world. The old man who asked about her marriage prospects earlier has fallen into conversation with her father's cousin about seed grain, comparing notes on which fields yielded well this past year and which struggled, the kind of practical agricultural conversation that threads through every gathering in this world, regardless of how festive the occasion, because the harvest was never far from anyone's mind here, not truly, not even at the height of a midwinter celebration, since the entire structure of survival through a Norwegian winter rested on decisions made and hay gathered and animals slaughtered many months earlier, and a feast like tonight's, for all its warmth and generosity, existed within careful limits set by exactly those earlier decisions, every roasted joint of meat and every full horn of mead, a quiet reminder of a year that had on balance gone well enough to make an evening like this one possible. Let me tell you now about something that happened earlier in the evening that I set aside deliberately because I wanted you to have the full shape of the hall in your mind first before returning to it. And that is the specific ritual around the very first guest to arrive tonight, before Bjorn and his wife, a detail Solveig noticed but did not fully understand the weight of until her mother explained it to her quietly on the walkover earlier this evening. The first guest through Thorvald's door tonight was not a neighbour or a friend of long standing. It was a stranger, a traveller passing through the valley, a man nobody in the hall had met before, seeking shelter from the weather and the failing light, and the way he was received tells you almost everything you need to know about how seriously this culture treated the specific, sacred obligation of hospitality towards strangers. He was welcomed with exactly the same formal warmth extended to every other guest tonight, the same waiting at the door, the same offered horn from Gunhild's own hand, the same seat found for him at the table, not at the very edge with the lowest standing, but in a position that acknowledged the specific honour due to a traveller in need. This was not simple kindness, though it was that too. It reflected a deep and widely held belief, referenced again and again in surviving Norse poetry, that a guest arriving at your door might be anyone, might carry any story, might, the old poems suggest almost playfully, even be a god travelling in disguise to test the household's worthiness, and that turning away a traveller on a night like tonight, cold and dark and dangerous to be caught outside in, was among the deepest failures a household could commit. Solveig's mother told her, walking over in the last grey light of the afternoon, that a household's true character showed not in how it treated its honoured friends, who arrived expecting and receiving warmth, but in how it treated the stranger who arrived expecting nothing at all. The traveller, whose name Solveig has caught only in passing, Ketil, is seated now not far from her, and he has spent much of the evening answering polite questions about where he has come from and where he is bound. Questions asked with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, since news and information carried by a traveller like this represented real, valuable currency in a world without any faster way for word to move between distant valleys. He speaks of a market town further south, of prices for wool and dried fish, of a wedding he attended weeks ago in a hall 2 fjords over, and the guests around him listen with real attention, occasionally asking him to repeat some detail or clarify some name, building, piece by piece, a slightly more complete picture of a wider world most of them will never personally see. There is an unspoken understanding, too, that Ketil owes his hosts something in return for tonight's welcome. Not payment, not in any commercial sense, but simply the honest, generous sharing of whatever news and stories he carries, and he seems entirely willing to give it, settling in for what has clearly become, over the course of the evening, a genuinely enjoyable exchange rather than any kind of obligation weighing on him. This is the reciprocity that held this entire hospitality system together across the whole Norse world, hall after hall, valley after valley, a traveller fed and warmed and sheltered tonight, becoming, tomorrow or next week, in some other hall further down his road, the very same kind of welcome guest, carrying forward, this time, whatever news and stories he gathers here tonight, the entire network sustained by exactly this kind of endless, generous circulation of care and information, passed hand to hand, hall to hall, across a landscape that offered so few other ways for word or warmth to travel. The night has deepened further now, and the quality of light in the hall has shifted with it, the lamps along the walls burning lower, needing to be refilled or trimmed by a servant moving quietly along the perimeter with a small horn of oil, and the fire itself has settled into a steadier, less showy burn than it held earlier, less flame and more heat, the kind of fire that a household lets run through the deepest part of the night, banked carefully enough to hold its warmth for hours without needing constant attention. Solveig notices that fewer guests are standing now, the earlier restlessness of the evening, the movement between clusters and benches, giving way to a more settled, seated stillness, people arranging themselves more permanently now, leaning against the wall behind them or against a companion's shoulder, the particular heaviness that comes over a room full of well-fed, well-warmed people well past their usual hour for sleep. A conversation 2 benches down has turned towards something Solveig finds herself listening to more closely than she expected. A woman describing, in the unhurried, circling way people tell stories very late at night, an illness that swept through her farm 2 winters past, and how her household survived it, which herbs were used, which neighbour came to help despite the risk of catching it themselves, and there is something in the telling that carries real weight without ever becoming heavy or sad in the way it lands. A story about hardship told, at this hour, in this warmth, less as tragedy and more as testimony, proof simply that the telling itself survived, that the household survived, that here they all are now, warm and fed, on the other side of it. This, I think, is worth pausing on, because it captures something true about how people in this world related to hardship generally, neither denying it nor dwelling on it in the way a modern telling sometimes might, but folding it, matter-of-factly, into the ordinary texture of conversation, one story among many, no more or less worthy of mention than the story about the boat handling well in a storm, or the poem about the Whale Road. Life in this valley, in this century, held real and constant hardship, cold and hunger and illness and loss, none of it hidden or softened, and yet the response to that hardship, at least on a night like tonight, was not withdrawal or grimness, but exactly this: gathering, warmth, food shared generously, stories told honestly, the community's collective insistence, expressed through nothing more dramatic than a shared meal and a warm hall, that life continued and was worth continuing to celebrate even in its hardest seasons. Eric has taken up his position once more, drawn back by a quieter request this time from a small cluster near the hearth rather than the whole hall's attention, and he offers something different now, not the grand alliterative verse of earlier, but something gentler, almost a lullaby in its rhythm, a short piece about the turning of the seasons, winter giving way eventually, as it always eventually does, to the first green shoots of spring, and Solveig finds her eyes growing heavy as she listens, the particular late-hour heaviness that no amount of interesting conversation can entirely hold off forever, and she is not alone in it. Several of the older guests nearby have their eyes closed now too, not quite asleep but resting, letting the poem wash over them the way you might let music wash over you, more felt than actively followed. There is a particular ritual that happens toward the later stretch of a feast like this one that Solveig has always found strangely moving, even as a child too young to fully understand its significance, and it is happening now, quietly, at the edges of the hall, while the poem drifts on near the hearth. Gunhild has begun moving again, this time not greeting new arrivals, since none are coming this late, but checking in, briefly and individually, with guests who came from farther away, from farms distant enough that the walk home tonight will be long and cold, making sure, in her quiet and thorough way, that each of them has been offered enough food to carry home if they wish, that anyone travelling with young children has been given warm stones wrapped in cloth to tuck into their cloaks for the walk, that nobody is leaving this hall less prepared for the cold than they need to be. This too is hospitality, extending past the walls of the hall itself and out into the dark road home, a household's care for its guests, not ending the moment they step back out into the night, but following them, in small practical ways, as far as it reasonably can. A young mother nearby is gathering her sleeping child from among the furs along the wall, lifting the small weight carefully, the child barely stirring, already wrapped snugly enough to survive the walk, and her husband is receiving from a servant a small parcel of food, bread and a portion of meat wrapped carefully, a gift for the road that Gunhild arranged without being asked, simply understood as part of what a good household does for guests who have come a long way and must now go a long way back. The couple thanks their hosts with real warmth, not the formal thanks of the evening's earlier greetings, but something more personal, and Thorvald rises from the high seat to see them properly to the door himself, a gesture that carries its own quiet weight, the host personally overseeing a guest's departure the same way he personally, through Gunhild, oversaw their arrival hours ago, the whole evening bracketed, beginning and end, by exactly this kind of careful, unhurried attention. Outside, when the door opens for them, the cold rolls in one more time, sharper now than it was earlier in the evening, the sky beyond visibly clearer, stars showing through gaps where the clouds have finally broken apart following the snow, and the family steps out into it, cloaked and warmed and fed, the door closing behind them, and Solveig, watching from her seat, finds herself thinking about the walk ahead of them, dark and cold, and probably beautiful in the particular stark way a clear winter night can be beautiful, Snow crunching underfoot, breath visible, the whole enormous quiet of the valley wrapped around three small figures moving carefully home under more stars than a modern sky, dimmed by so much electric light, would ever let you see. Not every guest is leaving yet, though, and the hall settles back into its earlier warmth once the door has closed against the cold, the small ceremony of departure absorbed back into the evening's larger rhythm without disrupting it. There is a second wave of eating happening now, lighter than the earlier meal, guests reaching for cheese and bread and the last of the dried fruit rather than fresh meat, the kind of unhurried, grazing eating that happens naturally once the main hunger of the evening has been thoroughly satisfied, and what remains is simply the pleasure of having good food within reach, while good company continues around you. Solveig finds herself in conversation now with a girl close to her own age, someone from a farm on the far side of the valley she has met only briefly before tonight, and the two of them fall into the easy, curious talk of people who suspect they might become friends if given the chance, comparing notes on their households, on a shared acquaintance, on the small daily textures of their different farms, whose sheep lambed well this year, whose loom needs replacing, ordinary details that carry, underneath their ordinariness, the beginning of exactly the kind of relationship that a feast like this one exists to seed and encourage, two young women whose families might, in years ahead, find themselves connected through marriage or trade, or simple ongoing friendship, all of it beginning here, tonight, in an unremarkable conversation by a fire that neither of them will specifically remember starting, but whose consequences might unfold across the rest of both their lives. I want to mention something about belief here, briefly, because it threads through the evening without ever being made the center of it. The way religious and cosmological ideas in this world tended to sit alongside daily life rather than standing apart from it in any separate formal category. The gods invoked in tonight's early toast, Odin chief among them tonight, given the season and the household's particular devotion, were not distant, abstract figures reserved for temple ritual, but present, in a sense, in exactly this kind of ordinary domestic celebration, their names spoken over a shared horn of mead, the same evening that guests discuss grazing boundaries and children's marriage prospects, the sacred and the practical woven together so thoroughly that separating them, the way we might instinctively want to today, would have made little sense to anyone in this hall. A charm murmured over a sick child, a small offering of food left at a boundary stone, a toast to Odin at a midwinter feast. All of it existed on a single continuous spectrum of everyday practice, rather than divided into separate categories of religious and secular life. The girl Solveig has been talking with mentions, in passing, a dream her grandmother had last winter, interpreted within the household as a sign about the year ahead, and Solveig nods along without any skepticism, because dreams in this world carried real, taken seriously weight, treated as one legitimate source of insight among several, alongside the more practical signs a farmer might read in weather patterns or animal behavior. None of this feels strange or notable to either girl. It is simply how the world works, the visible and the unseen sitting close enough together that moving between them in ordinary conversation requires no special transition at all. Another small custom catches Solveig's attention now, one she has seen before but never quite thought about directly until tonight. When a guest finishes drinking from a shared horn and passes it onward, they do not simply hand it to whoever happens to be nearest. There is a direction to the passing, sunwise, following the path of the sun as it appears to move across the sky, and this small, consistent choice, repeated without exception every single time a vessel moves from hand to hand tonight, reflects a broader pattern in how this culture ordered its rituals, aligning small human actions with the larger movements of the natural world, a kind of quiet, constant harmony maintained between the hall's internal customs and the sky and seasons outside its walls. Nobody explains this rule to a child, they simply absorb it, the same way Solveig absorbed it years ago, watching horns move sunwise around countless family meals long before she understood there was a name or a reason for the pattern at all. The fire has been fed once more, and this time it is Thorvald himself who does it, rising from the high seat to add a substantial length of oak to the coals, a gesture that carries its own small significance, since the host tending his own hearth personally, even with servants available to do it for him, signals a particular kind of hands-on care for his guests' comfort that goes beyond simple delegation. The oak catches slowly, oak burning longer and steadier than the quicker birch used earlier in the evening, exactly the kind of wood a household saves for the deepest, latest hours of a feast like this one, when the fire needs to hold through many more hours without demanding constant attention. Solveig's father catches her eye across the hall and gives a small nod, the kind of nod that says, without needing words, that the night is good, that he is glad they came, and she nods back, feeling something settle warmly in her chest that has nothing to do with the mead and everything to do with simply being here, in this room, on this particular cold night, surrounded by these particular people. She thinks briefly about telling her grandmother about tonight, about the seat she was given, closer to the centre than ever before, and then remembers, with the small ordinary sadness that accompanies exactly this kind of thought, that her grandmother has been gone 3 winters now, and that this is one of those thoughts that arrive sometimes at the edges of a good evening, not painful exactly, just present, a reminder that the people who taught you to notice these small rituals in the first place are not always still there to hear about the ones you notice on your own. The hall has quieted further, the loudest conversations of earlier in the evening replaced now by a lower, steadier hum, and several guests have shifted into that particular late-night posture of people settling in for the longer, slower, final stretch of an evening, leaning back, feet stretched toward the fire, conversation slowing into the unhurried kind that does not need to fill every silence, comfortable simply existing alongside the people nearby, without constant talk. Let me walk you through the layout of the tables themselves a little more closely now, because there is a specific logistics to feeding this many people from a single kitchen that deserves attention. Behind the main hall, connected by a short covered passage, sits a separate cooking structure, deliberately set apart from the main living space, both to keep the worst of the smoke and heat away from the feast itself, and to reduce the risk of a kitchen fire spreading into the timber hall where dozens of people are currently gathered. 2 women and a boy have been working in that kitchen since well before dawn today, and they are working there still, even now, this deep into the evening, keeping food warm, preparing the next round of bread, tending a fire of their own that never really stops through an event like this one. Solveig has not seen either of these women all evening, and she realizes, thinking about it now, that she probably will not, that their entire contribution to tonight's warmth and abundance will remain, for her at least, essentially invisible, known only through its results rather than its labor. This division between the visible feast and the invisible kitchen that makes it possible mirrors something true about how credit and memory worked more broadly in this world. Thorvald will be remembered in the stories told about tonight in weeks and months ahead as a generous and capable host. Gunhild will be remembered among those who understand what they watched tonight as a skilled and gracious husfrejay. The 2 women in the kitchen, whose names Solveig does not even know, will not be remembered by name at all, their work absorbed entirely into the household's collective achievement, and there is something worth sitting with in that quietly, not as an indictment exactly, since this was simply how labour and credit were distributed in nearly every household of this era, but as a reminder that the warmth we are sitting in tonight, in this story, rests on a foundation considerably larger and less visible than the handful of named people whose actions we have been following. A servant brings a fresh platter from that unseen kitchen now, cuts of meat kept warm somehow, through whatever careful method the kitchen has developed over years of hosting feasts like this one, and sets it down near Solveig's end of the table, and she takes a piece almost without thinking, still full from earlier but unable to resist the smell of it, and eats slowly this time, savouring rather than simply consuming, aware, in a way she was not earlier in the evening, of everything standing behind this single piece of meat. The animal raised and slaughtered months ago, the smoke and salt used to preserve some of tonight's food through the autumn, the hours of roasting today, the invisible women tending the fire that cooked it. There is a moment, not long after this, when the hall's attention gathers once more, this time around a game rather than a poem, a favourite of Thorvald's by all accounts, Hnefatafl, a board game played on a carved wooden grid with pieces of bone and antler, one side defending a king piece at the centre, the other side attempting to surround and capture it before it can escape to the board's edges. 2 men have set up a board near the fire, and a small crowd gathers to watch, offering commentary and advice the players mostly wave off with good humour, and Solveig drifts closer too, drawn by the particular quiet intensity that settles over a room watching a close, well-played game. This game mattered more than simple entertainment in this culture. Its strategic patterns, attack and defense, encirclement and escape, echoing the actual military and political thinking these same men worked through in their ordinary lives, and a reputation for skill at the board carried real social weight, spoken of in something close to the same breath as skill with a blade or skill in negotiation. The game tonight is close, the defending king slipping narrowly past a near capture at one point that draws an audible gasp from the small crowd gathered around, and when it finally ends, the king escaping to the board's edge by the narrowest possible margin, the defending player throws both hands up with a triumphant shout that draws laughter and a round of good-natured groaning from the men who bet, informally and for nothing more than pride, on the other side. The game breaks up into more general conversation again, and Solveig notices that Kettle the Traveller has been drawn into a rematch, apparently known for his skill at the board in whatever hall he most recently stayed, and a small side conversation develops about where he learnt to play, another thread of the wider world folding itself into tonight's gathering, a technique or strategy he picked up somewhere south, apparently, now being demonstrated and discussed with real interest by men who will likely try it themselves the next time they sit down to a board of their own. The hour has grown late enough now that a second wave of departures begins. Guests who travelled from slightly closer farms but still face a walk substantial enough that leaving before it gets any later starts to seem sensible. The pattern repeats itself, the same careful attentiveness from Gunhild, food wrapped for the road, warm stones offered for young children, Thorvald rising to see the more honoured among the departing guests properly to the door, and each departure carries its own small warmth, thanks exchanged, plans made for the next visit, an invitation extended for a spring gathering still months away, but already, apparently, being informally planned even at this late hour of a midwinter feast, one gathering's ending already planting the seed of the next one. Bjorn and his wife, the very first guests we watched arrive tonight through the falling snow, are among this second wave leaving now, and their departure feels, to Solveig watching it, like a kind of bookend to the whole evening, the same formal warmth extended to them now in leaving that was extended to them hours ago in arriving, the cloak retrieved and refastened at the shoulder with its bronze brooch, a final horn offered and shared, before the door opens one more time to the cold and the two of them step back out into a night that has changed considerably since they walked in. The snow stopped now entirely, stars fully visible in a sky scraped clear by whatever wind pushed the clouds finally out of the valley, and Solveig watches the door close behind them and feels the particular, gentle melancholy that always seems to arrive at exactly this stage of a good evening. Not sadness exactly, just the quiet awareness that something good is beginning, gradually and without any single dramatic moment marking it, to end. The hall now holds perhaps 2/3 of the guests who filled it at its fullest, and the character of the evening has changed accordingly, quieter, slower, the remaining guests mostly those staying the night as house guests, rather than returning to their own farms, a common enough arrangement for those who travelled the farthest, or who share close enough ties with the household that a night on a bench near the fire, wrapped in furs, is simply understood as part of the visit. Solveig's own family falls into this category tonight, their farm close enough to walk home tomorrow in daylight, but far enough that a cold midnight walk holds no appeal when a warm floor by Thorvald's hearth is freely offered instead. Servants have begun quietly preparing for this, spreading extra furs and blankets along sections of the hall's floor and benches, the practical work of turning a feasting hall into a sleeping hall for the night, a transformation Solveig has witnessed before but never tired of watching, the same space holding such entirely different purposes within the span of a single evening. A pile of sheepskins appears near where her family has been sitting, and her mother begins arranging them with the same quiet, practiced efficiency she brings to nearly everything, testing the thickness against the cold floor, angling them to catch what warmth still radiates from the nearby hearth, without sitting close enough to risk a stray spark. Eric has settled now into a much quieter mode of storytelling, no longer performing to the whole hall, but simply talking, low-voiced, with a small remaining cluster near the fire, and Solveig catches fragments of it as she drifts near, Something about the old gods now, rather than any specific saga, a half-remembered piece of lore about the world tree and the wells at its roots, told less as formal recitation and more as the kind of casual mythological musing that late night and firelight and mead tend to draw out of even the most disciplined storyteller. Someone asks a question about Yggdrasil's roots, and Eric answers thoughtfully, admitting at one point that he is not entirely certain he has the details exactly right, that different tellings he has heard over the years disagree on certain particulars, and there is something Solveig finds oddly comforting in this small admission, the acknowledgement that even a skilled skold's knowledge has its edges, its uncertainties, its places where memory and inherited story blur slightly, rather than standing perfectly fixed. The conversation drifts unhurried, from the world tree to a debate, good-natured and entirely inconclusive, about whether the coming spring will arrive early or late this year, someone citing the behavior of birds seen last week, someone else citing an old saying about the particular pattern of this winter's first frost, none of it scientific by any modern standard but all of it taken seriously, the accumulated folk observation of generations who depended, in very real and immediate ways, on reading the natural world correctly. Solveig's mother has settled onto the sheepskins now, gesturing for Solveig to join her, and Solveig does, grateful suddenly for how tired she has become without quite noticing it happening, the day's excitement and the evening's warmth and food and drink all catching up to her at once now that there is finally a soft, warm place to lie down. She stays sitting upright for now though, unwilling yet to fully surrender the evening, watching the fire and listening to the low continuing hum of conversation around her, the particular privilege of being just barely old enough to stay up for this part of the night, the part her younger cousins, asleep already along the far wall, will not remember tomorrow at all. Thorvald himself makes one more circuit of the hall before the night settles fully, pausing at each remaining cluster of guests, not with any formal purpose now, no more toasts, no more ceremony, just a chieftain checking, in the unhurried way of a man satisfied with how his evening has gone, that everyone remaining is warm enough and comfortable enough for the night ahead. He stops near Solveig's family, crouches slightly to speak with her father at eye level, a small gesture of equality that a man in the high seat does not owe to a farmer of modest standing but offers anyway, and the two of them fall into a low conversation about spring planting, about a trade Solveig's father has been considering, Thorvald offering an opinion asked for rather than imposed, and Solveig watches, half listening, understanding without being told that this quiet, unhurried, late-night conversation is itself another small thread in the larger fabric the whole evening has been weaving, alliance and trust built not through any single dramatic gesture, but through exactly this accumulation of small moments, repeated across years of feasts like this one. Gunhild passes by once more too, and this time she pauses specifically for Solveig, crouching down the way Thorvald did for her father, and says something Solveig will remember for a long time afterward, a quiet, direct compliment about how well she carried herself tonight, how well suited she seemed to her new seat closer to the hall's centre, and Solveig feels her face warm with a pleasure that has nothing to do with the fire's heat. This small, specific acknowledgement from the woman who has spent the entire evening demonstrating exactly what real competence and grace under the pressure of constant, unrelenting hospitality actually looks like. Gunhild moves on before Solveig can find quite the right words to answer, but the words were not really the point, the moment was. The fire has burned down considerably now, no longer the tall active flame of earlier in the evening, but a deep, steady bed of glowing coals, with only occasional small flames licking up along one edge where the most recent log has not yet fully caught, and the quality of light in the hall has shifted with it, warmer and dimmer at once, shadows pooling more thickly now in the corners and along the roofline, faces lit in softer, more forgiving tones than the brighter, sharper light of the evening's earlier hours. Solveig lies back finally against the sheepskins, her mother's steady breathing already slowed into sleep beside her, and stares upward at the underside of the roof, where firelight still catches faintly on the carved beams, the shifting shadows among the interlocking patterns carved there seeming, in this dimmer, later light, even more alive than they did earlier, shapes suggesting themselves and dissolving again as the coals below pulse gently with each small current of air moving through the hall. She can hear, faint now, the last few voices still awake somewhere near the far end of the hall. Eric's low voice among them, still talking, still telling some quiet fragment of story to whoever remains awake to hear it. The words themselves no longer distinct at this distance, just a low, warm, continuous murmur, the sound of a good evening finally, gently, running down toward its close. Somewhere outside, muffled by timber and turf and the last remaining snow on the roof, the wind has picked up slightly, a soft, steady sound against the walls, not threatening, just present, the ordinary sound of a cold, clear winter night continuing on outside this warm, sealed room exactly as it will continue on, regardless of what happens inside these walls. I want to step back from the hall for a moment, gently, without leaving it entirely, and tell you a little about how we actually know all of this, because I think it adds something to sit with while the fire burns low and the hall settles further into sleep around us. Much of what we understand about Viking feasting culture comes from a combination of sources that, taken individually, are each incomplete, but which together build something reasonably solid. The sagas, written down in Iceland roughly 2 to 3 centuries after many of the events they describe, preserve enormous amounts of detail about hospitality, feasting, seating hierarchy, and social obligation, even though they were composed well after the conversion to Christianity. Looking back at an earlier pagan world their authors were already several generations removed from. Poems like the Havamal, a collection of wisdom verses attributed to Odin himself, offer remarkably specific, practical guidance about exactly the kind of guest behavior and host obligation we have been watching play out tonight. Warnings against overstaying a welcome, praise for moderation in drink, instruction on how a wise guest ought to conduct himself at another man's table. Archaeology fills in a great deal more. Excavated longhouse sites across Scandinavia, in Norway, in Denmark, in Iceland, have revealed exactly the kind of central hearth, raised bench, post-supported structure we have been imagining tonight, along with the material traces of feasting itself, animal bones showing patterns of slaughter and butchery consistent with large-scale hospitality events, fragments of drinking vessels, occasionally, in wealthier sites, remnants of imported goods that tell us these households were connected to trade networks stretching remarkably far beyond their own valleys, glass beads from further south in Europe, silver from trade routes running east, evidence of a world considerably more interconnected than the isolated, insular picture popular imagination sometimes assumes. None of these sources is perfect. The sagas romanticize, the poems generalize, the archaeology can tell us what people ate and where they sat, but cannot fully recover the specific words spoken over a specific horn on a specific winter evening the way we have imagined it tonight. What Solveig and Gunhild and Thorvald represent in the story we have been following is a plausible, carefully considered reconstruction, built from these overlapping fragments of evidence, an attempt to fill the gaps between what the sources tell us directly and what a full, breathing evening in a real hall must have actually felt like, the sounds, the smells, the small human moments that no saga bothered recording because they were too ordinary, too obvious to the people living them, to seem worth writing down at all. This is, I think, part of what makes an evening like the one we have spent together tonight worth returning to, again and again, in the imagination. Not because it is exotic or strange, though it is undeniably both of those things from where we sit now, but because underneath the unfamiliar customs, the horns and the high seats and the sunwise passing of a shared cup, the actual human concerns on display are so completely recognizable. People wanting to be good hosts, people wanting to be remembered well, parents wanting warm children and full bellies, old friends teasing each other by a fire, a traveller grateful for shelter, a young woman noticing for the first time that she has been given a slightly better seat than before, and understanding, without being told, exactly what that means. Let me tell you a little more about how a feast like this one would have varied depending on where in the Norse world it took place, because Solveig's Valley in western Norway represents only one version of a custom that spread, with real regional variation across an enormous geographic range. In Iceland, settled only a few generations before the evening we are imagining tonight, households often lacked the same depth of accumulated timber wealth that a Norwegian valley like this one could draw on, since Iceland's landscape offered far less usable timber than the forests of the Norwegian mainland, and halls there were frequently built with a higher proportion of turf and stone, driftwood salvaged from the coast substituting where local timber ran short, giving Icelandic feasting halls a somewhat different character, lower, more insulated, shaped by a landscape that demanded even more ingenuity from its inhabitants than Solveig's own comparatively forested valley required. In the Danish lowlands, further south and considerably milder in climate, halls tended to be larger, feasting culture there sometimes reaching a scale that dwarfed what a modest chieftain like Thorvald could offer. Royal and near-royal halls hosting hundreds of guests at once, the same underlying customs of first horn and honoured seating stretched across a much grander canvas, though the core logic, the same sunwise passing, the same seating hierarchy radiating outward from a central high seat, the same obligation of generous hospitality, remained recognisably consistent across this enormous range, evidence of just how deeply and widely shared this particular cultural grammar of hospitality actually was across the whole Norse-speaking world, from Iceland in the far west to trading posts along rivers deep in what is now Russia in the east. Even the specific foods varied by region and by what a particular landscape could provide. A coastal household like the one hosting a feast tonight leaned more heavily on fish, both fresh and preserved, than an inland household further from the sea might, while a household with especially rich grazing land might offer more beef alongside the pork and mutton we have watched served tonight. Trade brought variation too. A wealthy household with strong connections to trade routes running south and east might, on a special occasion, offer guests a taste of something genuinely exotic by local standards. Spices carried an enormous distance, wine rather than only mead and ale, small luxuries that told their own story about a household's reach and connections, even more clearly than the silver-rimmed horns and fine wool garments we have already discussed tonight. Solveig's own valley sits somewhere comfortably in the middle of this whole enormous range, prosperous enough for tonight's evident abundance, connected enough to the wider trading world that a traveller like Kettle passes through with news from a market town further south, but modest enough still that tonight's feast, however grand it feels to Solveig sitting inside it, represents a considerably smaller and more intimate gathering than the largest halls of this same broad Norse world could offer on their own grandest occasions. This does not make tonight any less real or any less significant to the people actually living it. A chieftain's obligations and a husfrisha's careful management mattered just as much on this modest valley-bound scale as they did in the grandest hall in Denmark. The fundamental human work of hosting well, of building trust and alliance through shared warmth and shared food, scaling up or down without losing its essential shape or its essential importance to the people whose lives depended on getting it right. Back inside the hall now, the fire has burned down further still, and Solveig has drifted somewhere in that pleasant hazy middle ground between waking and sleep, aware of the room around her but no longer fully tracking the specific conversations still murmuring somewhere nearby. Everything softened at the edges, sounds blending pleasantly into each other the way they do in the last stretch before sleep finally fully arrives. She thinks, in the loose, unstructured way thoughts move at this hour, about the seat she was given tonight, about Gunhild's quiet compliment, about the small alliance seeded earlier in an ordinary conversation about rope and autumn slaughter, about Ketil the traveller already probably imagining tomorrow's road ahead of him, carrying with him whatever fragments of tonight he chooses to remember and retell in whatever hall receives him next. A log settles in the hearth with a soft collapse, sending up a brief small shower of sparks that catch and vanish almost instantly against the dark of the roof above, and the sound is enough to pull Solveig back, briefly, closer to full waking, and she opens her eyes to find the hall transformed once more from how it looked even an hour ago, most of the benches now holding sleeping shapes wrapped in furs and cloaks, the standing, moving evening entirely given way to this quieter, horizontal, resting one. Near the hearth, only 2 or 3 figures remain upright, low voices continuing some final unhurried conversation that will probably run, she suspects, until one or the other of them simply falls asleep mid-sentence, the way these late-night conversations sometimes do. Thorvald himself has retired now to whatever private sleeping space exists at the far end of the hall or in an adjoining structure, the details of which Solveig does not know and has never had reason to wonder about before tonight, and Gunhild, she notices, is one of the last still moving, making one final quiet circuit of the hall, checking, even now, at this late hour, that the fire is properly banked for the night, that no stray ember threatens the rushes, that every remaining guest has warmth enough to last until morning. This is the last thing Solveig sees clearly before sleep finally, fully claims her, the Husfridger's careful, tireless attention extending all the way to the very last minutes of an evening that began, hours and hours ago now, with exactly that same attention offered to the first guest through the door. Somewhere in the deepest hour of the night, long after Solveig has stopped noticing anything at all, the hall settles into something close to true silence, broken only by the soft, layered breathing of dozens of sleeping guests, the occasional shift of a body finding a more comfortable position against the wooden bench or the packed earth floor, and the low, steady, wordless sound of the fire itself, banked now into a deep bed of coals that will hold their heat through the coldest hours before dawn, glowing a deep, quiet orange beneath a thin grey coating of ash, needing nothing more from anyone until morning finally, gradually, begins to find its way back into the valley outside. I promised you at the start of tonight that we would talk honestly about why you specifically dropped into this hall without warning, would not have lasted the evening without quietly, repeatedly embarrassing yourself, and I think now, with the whole shape of the feast laid out behind us, is a good moment to gather that thought properly, not as a list, just as a kind of soft accounting of everything we have walked through together. You would have walked through that door and, most likely, simply found a seat, any seat, wherever looked comfortable or wherever a gap happened to be open, with no idea that you had just, without meaning to, announced something about your understanding of your own status relative to a dozen strangers who noticed every bit of it. You would have reached for the bread, probably, before the eldest person at your table had been served, the same small mistake that young man made earlier tonight, and while nobody would have shouted at you, you would have felt immediately that faint chill of a room quietly recalibrating its opinion of you. You would very likely have taken the first horn offered to you and simply drunk from it, without waiting for it to travel first through Gunhild's hands, without understanding that the sequence itself, who drinks first, who offers it onward, carried the entire weight of the evening's hospitality inside it. You might have passed a shared cup the wrong direction without a second thought, or lingered too briefly at the host's own table before wandering off to find more casual company, reading your own restlessness as simple friendliness while your host quietly read it as something closer to an insult. You would almost surely have missed entirely the small specific significance of Gunhild's chosen words as she welcomed each guest, the deliberate warmth extended to one arrival and a slightly more measured warmth extended to another, an entire silent conversation about relative standing happening in plain sight, in a language you were never taught to read. None of this, I want to be clear, is really about danger, not in the way the title of tonight's story might have first suggested to you. Nobody in this hall would have drawn a blade over a badly timed reach for the bread. The real risk, the real thing that would have made you the person everyone quietly discussed on their long cold walks home tonight, is much smaller and much more human than that. The risk of simply being marked, gently but unmistakably, as someone who did not understand the room, someone whose family, by extension, might not entirely understand the room either, and in a world built as thoroughly on relationship and reputation as this one was, that quiet, invisible mark could follow you and your household considerably further than any single evening's embarrassment ought to reasonably travel. What we have spent tonight learning together, walking beside Solveig from the falling snow at the door to the banked coals at the end of the night, is not a list of dangers at all. It is a map of care, an entire evening's worth of quiet, deliberate attention that this household paid to every single person who crossed its threshold. Attention so complete and so practiced that it looked, to anyone inside it who belonged there, like nothing more than warmth. Morning arrives slowly in this valley in the depth of winter, the sun clearing the eastern ridge late and low, its light arriving thin and pale rather than bright, but it arrives, eventually, and with it the hall begins, gradually, to stir back to life. Solveig wakes to the sound of someone building the fire back up from its overnight bed of coals, fresh kindling catching with a series of small quick pops, and she lies still for a moment, disoriented in the particular way sleep in an unfamiliar place produces, before the previous night reassembles itself in her memory, the snow, the horn, the poem, Gunhild's compliment, and she feels, even before she has fully opened her eyes, a lingering warmth from all of it that has nothing to do with the furs she is wrapped in. Around her, other guests are stirring too, in that slow, reluctant way people move after a late night and a warm bed. Someone groaning good-naturedly about how early it feels despite the sun already being up. Someone else already on their feet, folding furs, helping a servant clear space along the benches back toward its ordinary daytime arrangement. The smell of the hall this morning is different than it was last night. The sharp mead and roasted meat of the feast settled now into something mellower, wood smoke, and the particular cool morning air that has found its way in every time the door opens, carrying with it the smell of snow and faintly wood smoke from other households further down the valley already beginning their own ordinary morning routines. Breakfast, when it comes, is simple compared to last night's abundance, bread and cheese and a thin porridge. The household supplies too valuable to spend lavishly 2 days running, and nobody expects otherwise. The feast's generosity understood by everyone present as a deliberate, occasional exception rather than an everyday standard. Its very rarity part of what made it feel significant in the first place. Solveig eats quickly, aware that her family has a walk ahead of them this morning, and gathers her things, folding the fur she slept under and setting it in the pile a servant is collecting. And as she does, Gunhild passes by once more, this time simply offering a warm, unceremonious goodbye, entirely different in tone from the formal welcome of the evening before, the kind of goodbye extended between people who already trust each other, rather than the careful, calibrated warmth extended to a guest still being properly received. Walking out through the same door Solveig walked through the evening before, she finds the valley transformed by daylight, snow lying thick and undisturbed across the fields beyond the trampled path immediately around the hall. The sky a hard clear blue, the air sharp enough to catch in her throat with the first breath, and she looks back once at the hall itself, smoke still rising steadily from its roof, before turning to follow her parents down the path toward home. Already, in the quiet, unhurried way these things happen, turning last night's evening over in her memory, deciding which parts of it she will tell her grandmother's old friend down the valley when she next sees her, which parts she will simply keep, privately, for herself. But let us leave Solveig there for a moment, walking home through the snow with her parents, the hall behind her, its smoke still rising, and let us go back, just once more, to the hour we skipped past too quickly, the deepest, quietest part of that same night, the hour after the last conversation finally wound down into silence, and before the very first grey hint of morning found its way over the ridge. I want to spend a little more time there with you, because it is, I think, the part of this whole long story best suited to exactly where you are right now. In that hour, the hall holds nothing but sleeping bodies and settling fire, and the occasional soft creak of old timber cooling slightly in the deep cold, pressing against the walls from outside. The carved posts along the hall's length stand mostly in shadow now, their interlocking patterns visible only where the faintest ember glow catches an edge here and there, and the wall hangings, so carefully woven, so quietly expensive, hang still and dark, their colours invisible in this light, waiting for morning to give them back their meaning. Every drinking horn from tonight's feast has been collected now, rinsed, and set back in its place along a shelf near the kitchen passage, the silver rims catching whatever faint light reaches them, the whole elaborate hierarchy of the evening, who drank from which vessel and in which order, dissolved now into a simple, orderly row of clean cups, waiting for whatever ordinary use tomorrow brings. The rushes on the floor, scattered with the accumulated evidence of the evening, breadcrumbs and small bones, and the occasional damp patch where mead was spilled during some particularly enthusiastic toast, will be swept out tomorrow and replaced, the small physical trace of tonight's celebration cleared away within a day or two, leaving behind nothing material at all except what lives now only in memory, in the stories that will circulate outward from this hall over the coming weeks, carried by every guest who walked out that door tonight, and every guest who will walk out it tomorrow morning, carried by Kettle the traveller down whatever road he takes next, carried by Bjorn's wife the next time she visits a neighbour and happens to mention how well she was received, carried, most quietly and most permanently, by a 19-year-old girl named Solveig, who will, for the rest of her life, however long or short that life turns out to be, remember exactly what it felt like the first time she was given a seat closer to the centre of a hall like this one, exactly what Gunhild's voice sounded like, offering her that quiet, private compliment, exactly how the snow looked catching gold light in a doorway on a cold winter evening in a valley in western Norway, more than 1,000 years before you or I would ever hear her story told. The fire holds its steady banked glow through these deepest hours, needing nothing from anyone, a small persistent point of warmth and light in the middle of an enormous cold dark valley, in the middle of an enormous cold dark world, doing exactly what a good hearth is meant to do through the longest, hardest nights of the year, simply continuing, simply enduring, asking nothing in return except to be fed occasionally and trusted to keep doing what it has always done. I want to tell you a little more now about a few of the other guests who passed through that hall last night, because we followed Solveig closely enough that some of the other lives moving around her deserve a proper look too, even briefly, before we let this whole evening finally rest. There was a man near the far end of the hall, older, grey-bearded, who arrived a little later than most, and was given, despite his relatively plain dress, a seat with real honour attached to it, closer to the centre than his clothing alone would have suggested, and if you had been watching closely, the way Solveig eventually learnt to watch, you would have noticed the particular respect in how Thorvald greeted him, a slight bow of the head that he did not extend to guests of greater apparent wealth. This was a smith, a craftsman whose skill with iron, whose hands had shaped tools and blades and fittings for half the farms in this valley over the past 30 years, and whose reputation, built entirely on the quality and reliability of his work, carried a kind of honour in this world that had very little to do with land owned or silver counted. Skilled craft carried real weight in Norse society, smiths in particular occupying an almost specially regarded position, their work touching everything from a farmer's plough to a warrior's sword, and a smith known for honest, excellent work could expect, as this one clearly did tonight, to be seated well above what his modest farm alone might otherwise earn him. There was also a widow, seated among the women not far from Gunhild's own place, whose husband had died at sea some years back, and whose continued presence at gatherings like this one told its own quiet story about how this society treated women who found themselves, through loss, suddenly heading a household on their own. She had not remarried, apparently by her own choice rather than any lack of opportunity, and she ran her late husband's farm herself now, with the help of a grown son, and she was received tonight with exactly the same formal warmth extended to every married guest, her standing undiminished by her widowhood in a way that might surprise people who assume, without really examining the assumption, that a woman alone in this era must necessarily have occupied a diminished or vulnerable social position. She did not. Norse law and custom, whatever its limitations by modern standards, gave a widow real standing, real property rights, real capacity to continue running a household entirely on her own authority, and this woman's comfortable, confident presence at Thorvald's table tonight reflected exactly that reality. And there was a young man, barely older than Solveig herself, seated near the door with the other unmarried guests his age, who spent much of the evening in quiet, earnest conversation with one of Thorvald's own sons, and Solveig noticed, without quite meaning to pry, the particular attentiveness between them, something that read, to her eye at least, as considerably more than ordinary friendship, and she found herself thinking, later, about how a society this thoroughly organized around marriage as household alliance still made room, in its quieter corners, for exactly the kind of private, personal connection that no amount of careful family negotiation could ever fully account for or contain. Let me tell you a little more about the objects that filled that hall last night, because objects in this world carried stories the way people did, and a careful look at what sat on those tables and hung from those walls tells you almost as much about the evening as watching the guests themselves. The drinking horns we have discussed already, but there were other vessels too. Wooden cups turned smooth on a hand lathe, some of them carved with simple decorative bands near the rim, and at least one drinking bowl passed among a small group near the hearth that Solveig recognized as considerably older than the rest. Its wood darkened and worn smooth by generations of hands. A bowl her own mother mentioned once had belonged to Thorvald's grandfather, carried, she said, all the way from a settlement further north when the family first came to this valley, and there is something worth pausing on in that, the way a single wooden object could hold an entire family's migration story inside it, handed down carefully enough across 3 or 4 generations that even a 19-year-old guest recognized it on sight and understood, without needing the full story explained, that it mattered. The iron keyring at Gunhild's belt, which we mentioned near the very beginning of the evening, deserves one more look too, because those keys were not simply functional. Norse burial evidence from this period frequently includes keyrings placed deliberately in women's graves, a strong indication of just how central this specific symbol of domestic authority was to a woman's identity and status in this culture, something worth being buried with the same way a warrior might be buried with a sword, the Husfreger's keys standing as the equivalent marker of a different, equally significant kind of power. Gunhild's own keyring, Solveig noticed at one point during the evening, held not just the expected keys to storerooms and chests, but a small worn amulet too, shaped vaguely like a miniature drinking horn, or perhaps a small hammer. It was difficult to tell exactly in the firelight, worn smooth from years of handling, the kind of small personal talisman that carried private meaning nobody would think to ask about directly. The tables themselves, we mentioned, were trestle-built, assembled fresh for the occasion, but the wood used for them, like the wood used for the benches and the carved posts holding up the roof, represented its own quiet story about this household's resources and connections. Good timber was not universally abundant across the Norse world, as we discussed regarding Iceland's relative scarcity of it, and a hall built with as much substantial, well-worked wood as Thorvald's clearly signalled real accumulated wealth, wood that had to be felled and seasoned and worked by skilled hands, every beam and board representing labour and resource that a poorer household simply could not have commanded. There is one more thread from the evening I want to pull on a little further, because we touched it only briefly and it deserves more room, and that is the specific texture of the relationship between Solveig's family and Thorvald's household, the accumulated history that made tonight's invitation feel, to Solveig at least, like something earned rather than simply granted. Her grandfather, she has been told many times over the years, fought alongside Thorvald's own father decades ago, not in any great famous battle worth a scold's verse, but in a smaller, more ordinary dispute over grazing rights that nearly turned violent before careful negotiation, much of it apparently conducted over exactly this kind of shared meal, resolved it peacefully. That old alliance, sealed originally over food and drink much like tonight's, has been maintained ever since through a steady accumulation of small gestures, an invitation extended here, a favour returned there, a marriage very nearly arranged once between the two families, a generation back, that ultimately did not happen, but that left no lasting coolness between them regardless. This is worth sitting with, I think, because it illustrates something true about how alliance actually functioned in this world, not through any single dramatic oath sworn once and then forgotten, but through exactly this kind of patient ongoing maintenance, feast after feast, favour after favour, generation after generation, an alliance that has to be actively renewed rather than simply inherited and left alone. Thorvald did not invite Solveig's family tonight because some ancient binding contract obligated him to. He invited them because the relationship remains genuinely valuable to him, because Solveig's father is known as reliable and honest, because the friendship, whatever its distant origins, still produces real ongoing benefit for both households, and tonight's feast, for all its ceremony, functions as one more deliberate act of tending that relationship, keeping it alive for whatever the future asks of it next. Solveig thinks about this, walking home through the snow, her breath visible in the cold morning air, her boots crunching through the crust that formed overnight on top of yesterday's fresh fall, and she thinks too about her own eventual place in maintaining whatever comes next for her family's own web of relationships and alliances, whatever household she eventually joins through marriage, whatever new threads she will be responsible for weaving between her birth family and whatever family she marries into. It is not an unpleasant thought, walking through the cold, clean morning with her parents nearby and last night's warmth still somewhere in her chest. It feels, instead, like the natural next chapter of something she watched, with real clarity for the first time last night, being done extraordinarily well by a woman she now understands, more than she did before, to genuinely admire. Let us go back one more time, briefly, to the feast itself, to a detail from earlier in the evening that I set aside because I wanted to give the seating and the horns and the food their proper attention first, and that is the music more fully, because we mentioned the lyre and the singing only briefly, and there is more worth knowing about it. The instrument itself, a small lyre strung across a wooden frame, represents a tradition of stringed instruments found across the wider Norse and broader Germanic world, fragments of similar instruments recovered from bog sites and grave goods across the region, evidence that this kind of music-making was not incidental entertainment, but a genuinely old and widespread practice, and the songs performed on it tonight ranged from simple, familiar tunes that half the hall could hum along with under their breath, to more complex pieces that only the most practiced musicians in the valley could manage cleanly. The particular song that drew the most enthusiastic response from the hall last night was one Solveig has heard many times before at gatherings like this one, a call and response piece where the musician sings a line and the gathered guests answer with a familiar refrain, and there is something genuinely moving about the sound of an entire hall, dozens of voices, some strong and confident, some uncertain and slightly off-key, joining together on the same simple, repeated phrase, the kind of communal singing that asks nothing of anyone's individual skill and offers, in return, a feeling of belonging that a solo performance, however skilled, could never quite replicate. Solveig sang along too, her voice blending into the larger sound of the hall, and there is a particular pleasure in that kind of singing, she has always thought. The way your own individual voice disappears into something larger and somehow becomes more meaningful for having disappeared. Instruments were not the whole of the evening's music either. There was a stretch later, after the formal poetry had given way to looser storytelling, when someone began simply keeping rhythm by tapping a hand against the wooden bench, a soft, steady beat that others gradually joined, some clapping, some humming wordlessly along, building into something that was not quite a song and not quite mere noise, but something comfortably in between, the kind of spontaneous, half-organized sound-making that happens naturally in any room full of relaxed, well-fed people late in a long, warm evening, needing no formal structure at all to feel entirely satisfying. I want to take you back one more time to something that happened fairly early in the evening, something I mentioned only in passing when we were first watching guests arrive through the snow, because I think it deserves a fuller telling now that you understand the full shape of this world. When Bjorn and his wife first stepped through that door, cold and dusted with snow, there was a brief moment, easy to miss if you were not watching closely, when Bjorn glanced toward the high seat before he had even finished being greeted, a quick, almost involuntary check of where Thorvald sat and how he sat, upright and attentive rather than slouched or distracted, and Solveig realized only much later, thinking back on it, that this small glance was itself a piece of etiquette, a guest confirming, in the instant before any words were exchanged, that his host was properly prepared to receive him, present and attentive rather than caught mid-conversation with someone else, or otherwise unready for the formal moment of welcome about to unfold. Thorvald, for his part, had clearly been watching the door, ready the moment it opened, and this readiness, this attentiveness, mattered in ways that a modern visitor would likely walk straight past without registering at all. There is a broader principle sitting underneath this small detail, one that threads through nearly everything we have watched happen in this hall across the whole long evening, and it is this: almost nothing in a gathering like this one was actually spontaneous, however effortless and warm it all appeared on the surface. Thorvald's readiness at the door was prepared. Gunhild's verses of welcome, however personal and specific each one sounded, had, in all likelihood, been composed or refined in the days leading up to tonight, ready to be adapted slightly for whichever guest they were needed for, the seating arrangement appearing to unfold naturally as guests simply found their places, had in fact been carefully considered in advance, Gunhild and Thorvald together, in all likelihood, discussing days earlier exactly who should sit where and why, weighing relationships and reputations and recent events with the same seriousness a modern host might bring to arranging place cards at an important dinner. Even the apparent spontaneity of Eric's storytelling, the casual way he seemed to simply decide, in the moment, which poem to offer, rested on years of trained memory and deliberate preparation, a repertoire built and maintained specifically so that it could be drawn on, seemingly effortlessly, at exactly the moment a gathering like this one called for it. This is not a criticism. If anything, it is closer to a kind of quiet admiration, the recognition that what looks, from the outside, like natural warmth and easy hospitality, is very often the visible result of enormous invisible preparation, care taken so thoroughly and so far in advance that by the time the actual evening arrives, none of that labour shows at all, leaving behind only the warmth itself, apparently effortless, apparently simply given, when in truth it was built, deliberately, plank by plank, the same way the hall itself was built, timber by timber, years before any single guest ever walked through its door. Let me tell you now about the specific vocabulary of this evening, the words themselves, because language carried its own kind of ritual weight in this hall, and a few specific terms are worth knowing, not as academic vocabulary, but because understanding them lets you hear the evening a little more clearly than you could before. The feast itself, in the language Solveig and everyone in that hall spoke, would have been called a viesla, a word carrying connotations not just of a meal, but of a formal social obligation, a gathering bound up with duty and reciprocity as much as with pleasure. The high seat Thorvald occupied was the Ondvegi, a position so significant that in some traditions, when a family relocated to establish a new farm, they would cast the carved pillars of their old high seat into the sea and settle wherever those pillars washed ashore, trusting the gods to guide them to the right new home, a practice referenced in several surviving accounts of Iceland's earliest settlement. The word Gunhild would have used for her own role, husfreyja, translates roughly to lady of the house, but the English translation flattens something the original term carries more fully, an implication of formal domestic sovereignty rather than simple wifely status, a recognition built directly into the language itself that this role carried real, structural authority rather than existing merely as an honorary title attached to a husband's own position. Scale, the toasting word we discussed earlier, survives today in modern Scandinavian languages in essentially unchanged form, one of the few threads connecting Solveig's evening directly, across more than 1,000 years, to a toast raised in a completely different context in the present day. The same basic word, the same basic gesture, an unbroken thread of hospitality stretching across an almost unimaginable span of time. Even the word for guest itself, gesta, carried layered meaning in this world, related to words for stranger and for foreigner, capturing something of the specific tension this culture handled so carefully all evening, the guest as simultaneously outsider and, once properly received, temporary insider, someone whose unfamiliarity demanded exactly the kind of careful, deliberate hospitality we have watched unfold across this entire long night, precisely because a stranger's goodwill, once earned, could not be taken for granted the way a lifelong neighbour's might be. These words, and the concepts folded inside them, are not simply historical trivia. They are, in a real sense, the architecture underneath everything Solveig experienced last night, the invisible scaffolding that made an evening this elaborate, this carefully calibrated, feel entirely natural and unremarkable to everyone living inside it, the same way the grammar of your own native language feels invisible and automatic to you, structuring every sentence you speak without you ever needing to consciously think about the rules doing the structuring. There is one more scene from the depths of last night I want to bring you back to before we let this whole long evening finally close. Something small that happened near the very end, after most of the guests had already settled into sleep, that Solveig only half remembers now, caught somewhere between waking and dreaming when it happened. Gunhild, making her last quiet circuit of the hall, paused near the sleeping shapes of the youngest children gathered along the far wall, and crouched there for a long moment, simply watching them sleep in the low glow of the banked fire, unreadable at that distance but somehow Solveig thought even in her half-conscious state, deeply tender. This is a small moment, easy to miss entirely, the kind of thing that never makes it into any saga, any poem, any formal account of a chieftain's household, and yet it feels, somehow, like it belongs at the very centre of everything we have spent tonight learning about this world. All of the elaborate ceremony and careful hierarchy and formal hospitality existing, ultimately, in service of exactly this: children sleeping safely and warmly through the coldest, darkest stretch of the year, a household's entire accumulated skill and effort and tradition bent toward the simple, enduring goal of keeping the people inside it fed and warm and cared for until spring finally, eventually returns. Gunhild rose eventually from her crouch, moved once more toward the fire, added nothing to it, simply confirmed with a glance that it would hold, and then, for the first time in the many hours since guests began arriving through the falling snow, allowed herself to sit, fully, without any further task pulling her back to her feet, and stayed there, near the fire, for a long while, alone with her thoughts in the particular privacy that a room full of sleeping people somehow still manages to provide. What she thought about in that stretch of quiet, sitting near coals that had warmed and fed and welcomed dozens of people across the long hours of a single midwinter night, we cannot know, and there is something fitting in that too, I think. A woman who spent an entire evening making everyone else feel completely, effortlessly cared for, finally, at the very end of it, simply sitting with herself, unwatched, unperformed, entirely and quietly her own. Let me tell you a little about a concept that ran quietly underneath the entire evening, one that Solveig would not have named directly if you had asked her, because it was too fundamental to her worldview to require naming, the way you might not think to name gravity while simply walking across a room. The Norse concept of heminga, often translated loosely as luck, meant something considerably richer and more active than the word luck suggests to modern ears, closer to a kind of personal fortune or fate, bound up with a person's honor, their choices, and their household's accumulated standing, something that could grow or diminish depending on how well a person lived, how honorably they behaved, how generously they treated their guests and honored their obligations. A household's heimingja was not simply good fortune that happened to it, passively from outside. It was something actively built and actively maintained, and a feast conducted well, with proper hospitality and proper generosity and proper attention to every guest's honor, was understood, at some level, as an act that actively strengthened a household's heimingja, while a feast conducted poorly, with stinginess or rudeness or broken custom, could actively damage it. This is worth understanding because it reframes everything we have watched happen tonight, not simply as etiquette for etiquette's own sake, elaborate manners performed because tradition demanded them, but as something closer to active spiritual and social maintenance, every correctly offered horn, every properly honored elder, every generously wrapped parcel of food sent home with a departing guest, functioning as a small, deliberate contribution to the household's continued good fortune, its continued capacity to weather whatever difficulty the coming year might bring. Thorvald and Gunhild were not simply performing hospitality tonight because custom obligated them to. They were, in a very real sense within their own worldview, actively building the household's protection against future misfortune, one carefully conducted gesture at a time. There is also, tied closely to this idea, a related concept worth mentioning: the notion that a person's reputation and honor did not end with their own death, but continued, in a real sense, through how they were remembered and spoken of by those who survived them, which is precisely why the old bowl passed among guests near the hearth last night, the one inherited from Thorvald's grandfather, carried the weight it did, a physical thread connecting the living household's ongoing heiminga to the honor and memory of the ancestors who built its foundation. Solveig's own grandmother, 3 winters gone now, exists in exactly this way within her family's ongoing life, not present, not physically here, but still, in a real sense that this culture took entirely seriously, part of the household's continued fortune and continued honor, her memory a living thread rather than a closed, finished story. I want to spend a little time now on the food preservation that made an evening like this one possible in the first place, because everything served last night, Every roasted joint and smoked fish and preserved berry represented months of careful planning that began long before the first guest ever approached the door through the snow. Autumn in this valley meant slaughter, a significant portion of the household's livestock culled deliberately before winter, since feeding every animal through the cold months would have exhausted stores of hay and grain the household needed for its own survival, and the meat from that slaughter had to be preserved through methods that would keep it safe and edible across the many months separating autumn from spring. Salting was among the most important of these methods. Meat packed in salt, sometimes imported at real expense from trade routes reaching south, drawing moisture out and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that would otherwise spoil it within days. Smoking served a similar preserving function while adding flavor. Meat and fish hung for extended periods over a slow, carefully tended fire, the same birch and alder smoke that gave the smoked fish served last night its particular deep flavor, also drawing out moisture and adding compounds that helped prevent spoilage. Drying, too, played its part. Thin strips of meat or fish hung in a cool, airy space until the moisture content dropped low enough to make bacterial growth essentially impossible, producing a preserved food that could last, if stored carefully, for a genuinely long time, months at least, sometimes longer. Butter and cheese represented their own form of dairy preservation, milk that would spoil within days transformed, through careful, skilled processing, into forms that could be stored and used across the entire winter. The butter Solveig, spread on her bread last night, likely churned weeks or even months earlier, and kept cool in an underground storage pit, dug specifically for this purpose, insulated by the earth itself against temperature swings that would otherwise threaten its quality. Grain storage carried its own careful logic too. Barley and rye kept dry and protected from rodents in specially built storage structures, ground into flour only as needed rather than all at once, since flour spoiled considerably faster than whole grain, and a household's flexibility through a long winter depended on managing exactly this kind of careful, staged processing of its stores. Gunhild's authority over the household's storerooms, symbolized by the very key ring we discussed earlier, meant that she personally bore responsibility for judging, throughout the winter, exactly how much of each preserved food could be spent on an occasion like last night's feast, without endangering the household's ability to feed itself properly through whatever weeks or months of winter still remained ahead. A genuinely serious calculation resting on her judgment, made with real consequences if she judged it wrong. Let me tell you too about the mead itself a little more fully, because we mentioned it flowing freely all evening without ever quite explaining what made it, in this particular household, worth saving specifically for occasions like last night's feast, rather than drinking regularly the way the more common ale was consumed. Mead required honey, and honey in this cooler northern climate was neither abundant nor easily gathered, representing real labor and real risk, since managing bees and harvesting their stores demanded skill and no small amount of luck with weather and hive health across an entire season. A household like Thorvald's, wealthy enough to maintain hives or to trade reliably for honey from households that did, could produce a genuinely limited quantity of mead each year, fermented slowly over weeks or months, and that limited quantity meant mead functioned, in a household's calendar, as a specifically ceremonial drink, saved deliberately for occasions important enough to justify spending it, exactly the kind of midwinter gathering Solveig attended last night, rather than poured casually at an ordinary daily meal the way the more abundant ale was. This scarcity is part of why the first horn ritual we discussed so extensively carried the weight it did. Offering a guest mead specifically, rather than the more common ale, was itself a small additional signal of honor, a household demonstrating, through the specific choice of drink offered, exactly how significant it considered this particular guest, or this particular occasion. Solveig noticed, though she did not think much of it at the time, that some of the horns moving through the hall last night held ale rather than mead, offered to guests seated further from the high seat, a small, almost invisible gradation of honor folded into something as simple as what liquid filled a particular cup, one more thread in the same elaborate, mostly silent fabric of status and respect that structured nearly everything about how this evening unfolded. The specific flavor of the mead itself, herbs occasionally added during fermentation, bog myrtle sometimes, or other locally available botanicals, depending on what a household's land or trading connections provided, meant that no two households' mead tasted quite identical, and a guest who travelled between different halls across a season, the way Ketil the Traveller clearly did, would have developed, over years, a genuinely refined sense of which households produced particularly good mead, a small, specific form of expertise and gossip that would have circulated through exactly the kind of casual late-night conversation we watched happen around that hearth last night. One more thread of information travelling hall to hall, along with all the other news and stories a traveller like Ketil carried with him down every road he walked. There is a final custom I have been saving, deliberately, for near the end of this telling, because it happened only once during the whole evening, and it happened quietly enough that a visitor unfamiliar with this world would almost surely have missed it entirely, even sitting close enough to see it happen directly in front of them. Late in the night, after most of the formal toasting had finished and the hall had settled into its looser, more casual rhythm, Thorvald rose once more, briefly, not for any grand ceremonial toast this time, but to speak a short, quiet oath, formally renewing, in a few careful sentences, his household's ongoing friendship and alliance with a neighbouring chieftain who was not even present tonight, a man whose household Thorvald's family has been bound to through mutual obligation for 2 generations. This kind of renewal, spoken aloud, witnessed by everyone in the hall even though it concerned someone entirely absent, mattered because spoken oaths in this world carried genuine binding social weight, and a chieftain who let an old alliance quietly lapse without ever formally renewing it risked over time having that alliance simply dissolve through neglect, the same way any relationship neglected long enough eventually does. The guests in the hall who heard this short renewed oath understood exactly what they were witnessing, a piece of ongoing political and social maintenance folded seamlessly into what looked, on the surface, like nothing more than a pleasant, relaxed moment late in a long feast, and several of the older guests nodded slowly at specific phrases Thorvald used, phrases that apparently echoed, deliberately, language used in the original oath sworn between the 2 households 2 generations back, a careful, intentional callback that only someone with long memory of this specific alliance's history would have fully caught. This is one more example of something we have returned to again and again tonight, the way almost nothing in this hall was ever simply casual, the way even a brief quiet moment easy to miss carried, underneath its surface, real and serious social weight. And with that oath spoken and witnessed, the last piece of formal business the evening required had been completed, and the hall, from that point forward, belonged entirely and simply to rest, to the slow winding down we have already walked through together, the departures and the settling in, and the fire banked low, and the long quiet hours before morning finally, gradually, returned. I think, before we let this whole long night finally close for good, it is worth taking one more slow walk through the shape of the entire evening, not to repeat what we have already covered in detail, but simply to feel the whole arc of it settle, the way you might, at the end of a long journey, pause for a moment before stepping fully indoors, just to feel the whole distance you have travelled. Solveig arrived at that hall in the last grey light of a short winter afternoon, snow falling steadily and silently around her, nervous in the particular way a young woman is nervous when she suspects, correctly as it turned out, that tonight marks some small but real threshold in how her community sees her. She watched, from just inside that door, an entire evening's worth of careful, deliberate hospitality unfold, horn after horn, guest after guest, each arrival received with the same patient, thorough warmth that Gunhild had clearly spent years perfecting, warmth that looked effortless specifically because so much invisible preparation and practiced skill sat underneath it. She watched a hierarchy made visible in 100 small ways, in seating and in cups and in the order guests were greeted, a hierarchy that structured the whole evening without a single person needing to announce or explain it, absorbed by everyone present the way you or I absorb the unspoken rules of our own gatherings without ever really thinking about where we learnt them. She watched a stranger welcomed with the same careful warmth extended to old friends, watched gifts move down the hall as concrete, physical expressions of a household's honour and generosity, watched a scold hold an entire room's attention with nothing but memory and craft, and a voice pitched carefully to the size of the space. She watched a fire tended continuously by hands she never saw, watched a kitchen she never visited produce, hour after hour, food enough to feed dozens of people generously, watched the entire enormous coordinated effort of a household at its most demanding, most public, most carefully performed moment. And underneath all of it, she watched a woman, not a warrior, not a chieftain in the way we usually imagine that word, but a husfrieja, a lady of the house, hold together an entire evening's worth of diplomacy and management and ceremony with a steadiness that never once, across many hours, visibly faltered, offering, at the very end of it, when nearly everyone else had already fallen asleep, one small, quiet, private moment of genuine tenderness toward the sleeping children in her care, before finally, for the first time in the whole long night, simply sitting still. This is what a Viking feast actually was, underneath the version that popular imagination tends to reach for first. Not violence, not danger, not horned helmets and raised swords, but exactly this, an entire community's accumulated skill in hospitality and care, on full and generous display, warming a cold valley through the darkest, hardest stretch of an entire year. Let me tell you a little more about what happened to some of these threads in the weeks that followed, because a feast like this one did not simply end when the fire finally went cold. Kittul the traveller, we know from the shape of stories like his, would have continued his road within a day or two, carrying with him whatever news and impressions he gathered in Thorvald's hall. And somewhere down that road, in another hall entirely, in another valley, he would have been received with exactly the same careful hospitality, offered the first horn by another husfrieja entirely, and asked in turn for whatever news he carried, and among that news, very likely, some mention of the fine feast he attended a few nights back in a valley to the north, a good host, a gracious wife, a scold worth hearing, small fragments of praise that would travel, hall by hall, road by road, building slowly into exactly the kind of wider reputation that mattered so much to a household like Thorvald's. The girl Solveig befriended that evening, the one from the farm on the far side of the valley, would likely have found occasion to visit again before spring fully arrived, the small thread begun in an unremarkable fireside conversation growing, gradually, into something more substantial, visits exchanged, perhaps eventually a friendship lasting decades, the kind of ordinary, undramatic connection that never makes it into any saga and yet forms the actual texture of most people's lived lives, then as now. The smith we mentioned, seated with more honour than his plain dress alone would suggest, would have returned to his forge within days, back to the steady, skilled work that earned him that honoured seat in the first place, his reputation, built entirely on reliability and craft, continuing to accumulate quietly with every well-made tool and every satisfied farmer across the valley. And Solveig herself, walking home that morning through fresh snow, carried forward, we can imagine, a version of herself very slightly changed by the evening, a young woman who had for the first time been given a seat that acknowledged something real about her family's standing, who had watched, with new and closer attention, exactly what real competence and grace under sustained social pressure actually looked like, who had received, from a woman she deeply admired, a small, specific compliment that would likely stay with her for years, quietly shaping how she thought about her own eventual role, whenever it came, as the lady of some household of her own. I want to return one final time to the physical space of that hall itself, because I think there is something worth sitting with in simply picturing it, empty now, in the days after the feast, the tables taken apart and stored away, the trestles leaned against a wall, the rushes swept out and replaced with fresh ones, the hall returning to its ordinary everyday function as a working household's living space rather than the elaborate ceremonial stage it became for one long midwinter night. The high seat still stands where it always stands, its carved posts flanking an empty space now, waiting for the next occasion significant enough to fill it with the same careful ceremony we watched unfold. The shelf of drinking horns and cups sits quiet near the kitchen passage, clean and ordered, waiting for whatever ordinary daily use or whatever future occasion calls them back into service. Outside, the snow that fell so steadily during the feast's opening hours has settled now into the valley's ordinary winter landscape, still deep, still white, the path worn by dozens of arriving guests already beginning to soften and fill back in under fresh falls, and within a week or two, an observer walking past Thorvald's hall would see nothing to suggest that anything unusual happened there recently at all, just an ordinary farmstead settled into its ordinary winter rhythm, smoke rising steadily from the roof, livestock tended, daily tasks continuing exactly as they continue on every other farm across this valley through these same hard, cold months. And yet something did happen there, something real and consequential even if its physical traces disappeared within days. A whole intricate web of relationships tended and renewed, alliances quietly reinforced, a young woman standing subtly and permanently shifted, a traveller sent onward carrying warmth and goodwill that would echo, in small ways, down whatever road he walked next, a household's reputation, its Heiminger, its accumulated honour, actively strengthened through one long night's worth of careful, generous, exhausting, and ultimately invisible labour. This is what a feast like this one actually accomplished, underneath its considerable warmth and beauty, work disguised so completely as celebration that the people doing it, Gunhild especially, could spend an entire night performing an almost impossibly demanding role, and have it look, to every single guest who walked through that door, like nothing more than simple, effortless, generous hospitality. There is a particular kind of household object we have not yet talked about tonight that I want to bring in now, near the end, because it connects so directly to the season this feast belonged to, and that is the specific decoration that would have marked Thorvald's hall as prepared for exactly this midwinter occasion: evergreen branches, fir and juniper mostly, gathered in the days before the feast and hung along the walls and across the great beams overhead, their sharp, resinous scent mixing with the smoke and food smells we have already spent so much time on tonight, a small deliberate reminder brought indoors that something in this hard, dark season still stayed green, still stayed alive, a quiet promise expressed through nothing more than a few cut branches, that the apparent death of the landscape outside was not in fact permanent. This use of evergreen branches during the darkest stretch of the year reflects a pattern found across an enormous range of cultures in the Northern Hemisphere, the specific symbolic weight placed on anything that resisted winter's apparent erasure of all living green, and while we cannot know exactly what words, if any, Thorvald's household attached to this particular decoration, the underlying impulse feels, even now, entirely legible, entirely human, the same impulse that leads people today, in an entirely different world, with entirely different beliefs, to bring green branches indoors during exactly this same stretch of the calendar year, a thread of continuity running, unbroken and largely unexamined, from Solveig's cold valley all the way to whatever room you are lying in right now. The branches would have stayed up for some days after the feast itself, Solveig knew, slowly drying and browning near the walls until eventually, weeks later, someone gathered them up and fed them, finally, to the very hearth they had spent those weeks decorating, one last small use extracted from them before the household moved fully past this particular midwinter marker and back into the ordinary, unmarked stretch of deep winter that still, at that point, had a considerable distance left to travel before spring would finally, properly, arrive. There is one more character from that evening worth returning to before we let the whole night finally rest, and that is Thorvald himself, because we have spent so much of tonight watching Gunhild's labour, rightly, since it was so extensive and so easy to overlook, that Thorvald's own role risks fading into the background entirely, when in truth his part in the evening's success mattered just as much, simply in a different register. A chieftain's authority in this world rested on considerably more than land and inherited status. It rested on judgment, on the ability to settle disputes fairly, the kind of quiet negotiation Solveig glimpsed him conducting near the high seat about a grazing boundary. It rested on martial capability, real or reputational, the understood expectation that a chieftain could, if circumstances demanded it, defend his household and his followers, though tonight mercifully asked nothing of that particular capacity. And it rested, perhaps most of all on an evening like this one, on exactly the kind of generous, attentive hosting we watched him provide, rising to add wood to his own hearth, crouching to speak with a farmer of modest standing at eye level, seeing honoured guests personally to the door. A chieftain who delegated every part of hospitality entirely to his wife and servants, who never rose from the high seat, who never personally acknowledged a guest of lesser standing, would have been seen in this world as remote, as failing some real part of his obligation, however wealthy his hall or however skilled his husfrige. Thorvald's own visible effort throughout the evening, understated as it was compared to Gunhild's near constant motion, still mattered enormously to how the evening was received and remembered, a chieftain's personal warmth serving as its own kind of proof that his authority rested on genuine relationship rather than distant, unearned status. Solveig's father mentioned this once, walking home almost as an aside, praising specifically how Thorvald had crouched to speak with him rather than simply nodding from his seat, and Solveig understood, hearing it, that this small physical gesture had registered, for her father, as something genuinely significant, one more small thread in the enormous, mostly invisible fabric of mutual respect and obligation that a feast like last night's exists to weave and reweave, season after season, generation after generation, between households that depend, in ways both practical and deeply human, on each other's continued goodwill. I want to spend a little more time, too, on the children who drifted in and out of tonight's story without ever quite becoming its central focus, because their presence at a feast like this one tells its own quiet story about how this culture understood the relationship between celebration and ordinary family life. The boy we mentioned early in the evening, standing too close to the hearth until an older man gently swatted him back, spent much of the later evening running small errands for the kitchen, carrying empty platters back through the passage, fetching a forgotten item from a storeroom, tasks given to him not as punishment or exclusion from the feast, but as a genuine, expected form of participation. The household's youngest members folded into its labour the same way they were folded into its celebration, no sharp line drawn between the two. There is something worth noticing in how naturally this blending happened, a child's contribution taken seriously enough to matter, however small, while still leaving room for exactly the kind of wide-eyed wonder Solveig noticed in him earlier, standing close to the fire, drawn in by its warmth and its noise and its spectacle, the way any child anywhere might be drawn to exactly that combination. By the time he finally fell asleep, tucked among the furs along the wall with the other children, he had spent the evening moving fluidly between two roles, useful household member and delighted guest, without any apparent tension between them, a pattern that would have shaped, gradually and almost invisibly, his own eventual understanding of what hosting and community actually required. The very youngest children, infants really, some of them, were tended throughout the evening by older siblings or by mothers who simply kept them close, nursing quietly in a corner of a bench while conversation continued around them, entirely unremarkable, entirely expected, no separate room or separate arrangement considered necessary or even available in a household organized the way Thorvald's was, life's most ordinary, intimate moments unfolding in full view within the same hall, hosting an elaborate ceremonial feast, the two things coexisting without any apparent friction at all, a level of comfortable, everyday intimacy between public celebration and private domestic life that a modern gathering, with all its careful separations between formal and informal space, would likely find difficult to fully replicate. Let me tell you a little more about the boats that, though entirely absent from tonight's hall, sat somewhere in the background of nearly everyone's life in that valley, because it feels worth acknowledging, even in a story so deliberately centered on hearth and hospitality, rather than on ships and voyages, that this same culture's identity was bound up enormously with the sea, and several of the men in that hall last night, including Thorvald himself in years past, had made journeys by water that shaped their reputations and their households' fortunes just as thoroughly as any feast could. The boats themselves, drawn up now for winter in a shed near the shore, sat idle through these coldest months, their maintenance and repair a task saved for the calmer, lighter days of early spring, when a household's attention would shift, gradually, away from the deep indoor rhythms of a midwinter feast like last night's, and toward the outward-looking labour of preparing for another season of trade, of travel, sometimes of raiding, though we should say clearly, since this evening's whole purpose has been to move past that particular popular fixation that trade and ordinary travel occupied vastly more of most Norse households' actual maritime activity than raiding ever did, farmers and craftsmen and merchants moving goods and news along coastal routes far more often than warriors moved along them seeking conflict. Kittil himself, we might imagine, given his evident familiarity with a market town further south, had likely travelled at least part of his current road by boat before the winter closed the easiest water routes and forced him onto the slower, colder overland path that eventually brought him, cold and grateful, to Thorvald's door. The sea, even silent and iced at its edges through these winter months, remained a constant undercurrent beneath the valley's whole way of life, its rhythms of trade and travel shaping the household's calendar just as surely as the agricultural rhythms of planting and harvest did. The two systems, land and sea, interwoven so thoroughly that neither could be fully understood without the other. This is worth mentioning, I think, precisely because tonight's story has deliberately kept its focus close to the hearth, close to the hospitality and warmth of a single indoor evening, and it would be a mistake to let that close focus suggest that the wider world, the trade routes and sea voyages and distant markets that fed information and goods into a valley like this one, mattered any less to the people living here than the feast itself did. Both things were true simultaneously, an intensely local, intimate culture of hearth and household, and a genuinely far-reaching, interconnected world of trade and travel, each shaping the other in ways that made an evening like the one we have spent together tonight possible in the first place. There is one last small thread I want to follow before we finally let this whole long evening close, and it concerns the specific carved decoration on the two posts flanking Thorvald's high seat, something Solveig noticed early in the evening but did not think much about until much later, lying half awake near the end of the night, watching firelight catch and lose the pattern again and again along the wood. The carving showed, as closely as she could make out in the shifting light, a pair of interlocking animal forms, long-necked and long-bodied, biting at their own tails in a continuous, looping pattern that repeated the length of each post, a style of decoration common enough across the wider Norse world that Solveig had seen versions of it before, on brooches, on carved boxes, on the prow of at least one ship she remembered from a summer visit to the coast years earlier. This interlocking animal style, whatever specific meaning individual households attached to it, seems to have carried a broadly shared association with continuity, with cycles that fold back into themselves, beginnings and endings that are never quite as separate as they first appear, and there is something fitting, I think, in finding exactly this pattern carved into the posts flanking the household's most significant ceremonial seat, the place from which Thorvald offered his toasts to ancestors and gods alike, the place that anchored an entire evening's careful, cyclical repetition of hospitality, welcome given and welcome received, honour extended and honour returned, one generation's alliance renewed by the next, 1 year's midwinter feast echoing every midwinter feast that came before it, and anticipating every one still to come. Solveig fell fully asleep, finally, somewhere in the midst of tracing that pattern with her tired eyes, the looping animal forms blurring gently into the general soft dark of the hall around her, and whatever thoughts she carried into sleep that night, whatever specific mixture of pride and warmth and quiet, comfortable exhaustion, dissolved, the way such thoughts always do, into the deeper, wordless rest that follows a long, full, well-spent evening, the kind of sleep that asks nothing further of the person sleeping it, simply holding them, gently, until whatever comes next. Let me linger a little longer, before we close, on the wider pattern of feasts like this one across an entire Norse household's year, because tonight's midwinter gathering, however significant, represented only one point in a larger, recurring rhythm of hospitality that shaped Thorvald and Gunhild's household across every season. There would have been a feast, considerably different in character, marking the arrival of summer, held partly outdoors if weather allowed, built around the lighter, longer days rather than the deep, warm indoor intimacy of a midwinter gathering, its foods drawing more heavily on fresh, newly available produce rather than the preserved stores that formed the backbone of tonight's meal. There would have been smaller, more intimate gatherings tied to specific household events, a birth properly welcomed, a significant trade successfully concluded, a marriage negotiated and sealed, each occasion calling for its own scaled version of the same underlying hospitality customs we have watched unfold in full tonight. Gunhild's role as Husfreyja meant that she carried, across this entire annual rhythm, an accumulated ongoing expertise that a single evening, however demanding, could only partially reveal, a lifetime's practiced sense of exactly how much food a given occasion warranted, exactly which guests required which specific gestures of honor, exactly how to read a room's mood and adjust the evening's pacing accordingly, skills built and refined across years of exactly this kind of repeated, high-stakes hosting, each feast informing and improving the next. This is worth remembering as we finally let tonight's story rest, because it means that what we watched Solveig experience was not an isolated singular event, but one instance, beautifully particular in its own details, of a pattern this household had performed many times before and would perform many times again, each iteration slightly different, shaped by that year's harvest and that season's specific guests, and that particular night's weather, but resting always on the same deep foundation of care and skill and obligation we have spent this whole evening exploring together. I keep returning in my own mind to that image of Gunhild finally sitting, alone, near the banked fire, at the very end of the night, and I think it is worth sitting with a little longer myself before we close, because there is something in it that captures, more completely than any single custom we have examined tonight, the actual shape of what hospitality asked of a woman in her position. Across the many hours we have followed, she greeted, individually and with genuine specific attention, dozens of guests. She offered the first horn to each of them, spoke a fresh verse of welcome for each, tracked, in her memory alone, without any written record, the exact standing and history and mood of every single person who crossed that threshold, adjusting her warmth and her words accordingly, moment to moment, for the length of an entire evening. She managed the household's stores, judged correctly how much could be spent on tonight's abundance, without endangering the weeks of winter still ahead. She settled a quiet dispute between two older men, without either of them quite realizing they had been managed. She sent gifts down the hall calibrated precisely to reinforce specific relationships. She checked, individually, that departing guests carried warmth and food enough for their journeys home. She paused, at the very end, to watch sleeping children with an attention that asked nothing in return. None of this was performed as spectacle. None of it announced itself as remarkable. It simply happened, continuously, throughout an entire long night, absorbed so completely into the texture of gracious hosting that most of the guests experiencing its effects likely never once thought consciously about the effort producing them, the same way you might enjoy a beautifully set table without ever pausing to consider the hours of planning behind its apparent simplicity. This, I think, is worth naming plainly, once before we let it rest. What we watched tonight was labor, skilled and demanding, and largely uncredited labor, performed by a woman whose title, Husfreyja, carried real formal authority within her own world, but whose actual, hour-by-hour work would likely never appear in any saga, any poem, any account written down and preserved for people like us to read 1,000 years later. We know her tonight only because we chose to follow her closely, deliberately, the way this whole evening has asked you to do, and there is something worth honoring in that choice, in pausing long enough to actually see labor that an entire culture, however much it valued hospitality, still mostly took for granted. Let me tell you, finally, about the last sound that hall would have held before true silence fully settled over it, because I think it is a fitting note to carry with us as we, too, prepare to let sleep take over from here. Long after every guest had fallen still, long after Gunhild herself had finally gone to whatever quiet corner held her own bed for the night, the fire continued its low, wordless conversation with the room around it, an occasional soft settling of coals, an occasional faint hiss where a trace of moisture in the wood finally gave up its last resistance to the heat, small sounds that meant nothing and everything at once, the simple ongoing evidence of warmth persisting through the coldest, darkest hours regardless of whether anyone remained awake to notice it. Outside, the wind that picked up gently in the hours after Bjorn and his wife walked back out into the clearing night had settled again by the deepest hour, the valley falling into the particular hard, complete stillness that a truly cold, truly clear winter night can produce. Snow lying undisturbed and faintly luminous under starlight across every field and hillside for miles in every direction. The whole landscape held in a silence so complete that even the household's dog, curled now near the cooling edge of the hearth, seemed to sense it, sleeping more deeply and more still than it had at any earlier point in the long, noisy evening. And somewhere in the middle of all that vast, cold, silent dark, one small hall held its steady point of warmth and light and sleeping human breath, exactly as it was built, generations ago, to do exactly as it would keep doing, feast after feast, winter after winter, for as long as this household and its careful, patient, generous customs continued to be carried forward by each new generation raised inside its warmth. I want to leave you with one final image before we close, something small that Solveig would not have noticed herself, being asleep by that point, but that I find myself drawn to imagining anyway, a kind of last quiet detail to carry the whole evening gently to its end. Sometime in the deepest hour of that night, a servant, one of the household's own, rose briefly from her own place near the wall, moved quietly across the hall past dozens of sleeping guests, and checked one final time that the door was properly secured against the cold, that the fire's guard was set correctly to catch any stray spark, that everything the household needed to survive safely through the remaining hours of darkness was exactly as it should be. She would have done this on any ordinary night too, feast or no feast. The same quiet vigilance extended equally to a hall full of honoured guests, and to an empty hall holding nothing but the household's own sleeping family, because this too was simply part of what keeping a household meant in this world. An unglamorous, unremarked, entirely necessary form of care that never stopped, whatever else was happening, however grand or however ordinary the evening had been. She returned to her own place afterward, pulled her own blanket a little closer against the cold that always found its way in eventually, however well built the hall, and slept, herself, the same deep, satisfied sleep that had already claimed nearly everyone else within those timber walls, guest and host and servant alike, all of them held, for these few remaining hours before dawn, in the same simple, shared warmth that an entire evening's worth of careful, generous, exhausting hospitality had built and sustained, and finally, gently handed over to rest. The fire burned low and steady through what remained of the night, needing nothing further from anyone, and somewhere far off, the first faint grey hint of another cold winter morning was already, slowly beginning to gather along the eastern edge of the sky, though none of it, not one single person sleeping soundly in that warm, quiet hall, was awake yet to see it coming. Think too for a moment about the woven wall hangings we mentioned near the beginning of tonight's story, softening the timber walls of that hall, breaking the worst of the winter drafts. Each of them represented, we said, months of patient work at an upright loom, but I want you to picture the specific hands behind that work a little more closely now, since we have spent so much of tonight learning to notice exactly this kind of quiet, uncredited labour. Gunhild's own mother wove at least one of those hangings decades ago, according to a story Solveig half remembers hearing once, its pattern a slow, careful border of interlocking diamonds in dyed red and undyed cream, and it has hung in that same spot on that same wall through every feast this household has hosted since, warming the hall and honouring, quietly, a woman long since passed on, her skill and her patience still doing exactly what she built it to do, holding warmth inside these walls for a family she loved, long after her own hands stopped moving across that loom for the very last time. One very last detail, small enough that I almost let it pass without mention, but it feels right to include before we finally close. Near the door of that hall, easy to miss in all the warmth and noise further inside, hung a single iron bell, small and plain, rung only rarely, Solveig's father once told her, mostly to signal the start of some formal announcement or, in less happy years, to call the household together quickly in an emergency. It hung silent the entire evening we spent together tonight, unneeded, its stillness itself a kind of quiet testimony to how smoothly and safely the whole long feast unfolded. No emergency, no crisis, nothing at all beyond the ordinary, considerable work of hosting well. Solveig noticed it only once, glancing toward the door as a late arriving guest stepped through, and thought nothing more of it at the time, and yet I find myself glad, somehow, imagining it hanging there silent through the whole of that long, warm night, one more small proof that everything, on this particular evening, in this particular hall, went exactly as it should. Before we let the fire finally go all the way down, I want to return, one more time, to something we touched on earlier. The small parcel of food Gunhild made sure every departing guest carried home with them, because there is a detail folded inside that custom worth sitting with a little longer. The specific foods chosen for these parcels were not simply whatever happened to be left over. Gunhild selected them deliberately, matching the gift to the guest. A little extra portion of the good smoked fish for a household she knew was managing a leaner winter than most, a larger share of bread for a family with several growing children waiting at home, small, individually calibrated acts of generosity disguised, to any casual observer, as identical, ordinary hospitality. This is perhaps the clearest single example, across the whole long evening, of what real skill at hosting actually required. Not a single uniform gesture of generosity applied evenly to everyone, but dozens of small, specific, carefully considered judgments made continuously, quietly, without any guest ever fully realizing how individually they were being seen and accounted for. Solveig's own family carried home, that morning, a modest parcel of their own, bread and a portion of dried fruit, nothing extravagant, exactly calibrated, she would realize only much later, to a household that was managing perfectly well and needed no particular additional help, a small, precise acknowledgement of exactly where her family stood, neither singled out for special concern nor overlooked entirely, simply seen, accurately and kindly, the way a genuinely skilled host sees every single person who crosses their threshold. This kind of attentiveness, sustained across an entire evening and extended even into the final gesture offered to a departing guest, is, I think, the real answer to the question this whole story opened with, the real reason a modern visitor would have struggled so completely to find their footing in that hall, without causing quiet, repeated offense. It was never really about memorizing a list of rules. It was about the kind of sustained, genuine attention to other people that this entire culture had spent generations refining into something that looked, from the outside, like effortless warmth, and which was, underneath, one of the most demanding and most genuinely admirable social skills a person could cultivate in that world, or, honestly, in any other. There is one more small memory I want to leave you with before we finally close, something Solveig carried with her long after that particular winter passed, a tiny specific detail that had nothing to do with rank or ceremony at all. At some point late in the evening, during that long stretch when the hall had fractured into its dozen smaller, quieter conversations, she found herself, briefly, entirely alone for a moment, everyone nearby absorbed in their own talk, and she simply sat there, watching the fire, feeling for just that short stretch of time, wonderfully and completely unobserved, free of the careful self-awareness that had followed her through most of the evening's more formal moments. It was a small, unremarkable few minutes, the kind of thing that would never appear in any account of the feast, and yet it was, she would later think, one of her favorite parts of the whole night, this small pocket of solitude found unexpectedly in the middle of so much careful, attentive company, the fire crackling softly in front of her, the low, warm hum of dozens of other conversations surrounding her without demanding anything of her at all. I mention it because I think it captures something true about even the most elaborately structured gathering, that underneath all its careful ceremony and hierarchy and obligation, there remained room, always, for exactly this kind of small, private, human moment, a young woman simply watching a fire, thinking her own thoughts, belonging completely to the room around her, while also, for just a few minutes, belonging entirely to herself. That balance between the demands of community and the quiet dignity of a person's own inner life feels like a fitting note to end on tonight, because it is, I think, exactly the balance this whole long evening has been offering you too. All this company, all this warmth, all these careful details, offered generously, and yet asking nothing more of you now than to simply lie there, quietly, and let it all settle. Let me offer one final, wider thought before the fire finally goes all the way down. Something about why an evening like this one, so distant from anything in your own daily life, might still feel somehow familiar to you. Lying wherever you are lying right now, every culture, in every age, has needed some version of what Thorvald's Hall provided that midwinter night, a gathered place, warmed against the cold and the dark, where food is shared generously and stories are told well, and the people inside feel, for a few hours at least, thoroughly and completely cared for. The specific shape of it changes endlessly. Drinking horns become wine glasses, skalds become whatever storytellers a culture currently favors, a longhouse becomes a dining room, or a holiday gathering, or simply a quiet kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, but the underlying need, the deep human hunger for exactly this kind of warm, attentive, generous company, has never really gone anywhere at all. Solveig could not have imagined you, lying wherever you are lying now, more than 1,000 years and an entire world away from her cold, snow-covered valley, and yet I suspect she would have understood immediately, without needing any explanation, exactly why you might want to spend an evening imagining your way into her world, why the specific details of a hall you will never actually visit, a fire you will never actually feel, a Husfriar's voice you will never actually hear, might still offer something genuinely comforting to carry with you into your own sleep tonight. We are, all of us, still looking for exactly what that hall offered: warmth against the dark, company against the cold, and the quiet, steady certainty that morning, whenever it comes, will find us safe. So let the snow keep falling gently in your mind, over that valley you will not visit, and that fire you will not feel, and that whole warm, distant world we have spent this long evening imagining together. Let the hall stay lit, low and steady, somewhere just behind your closing eyes, and let yourself now, finally, follow Solveig all the way down into sleep. I have kept you in that hall a long while tonight, longer perhaps than any single feast itself actually lasted, but I think there is something right in lingering this long over an evening built, at its heart, entirely around the idea that time spent slowly and generously with other people is time spent well, that a good host does not rush a guest toward the door, does not hurry a story to its conclusion, does not measure hospitality by how quickly it can be dispensed with. Everything we have walked through together tonight, the falling snow and the first horn, and the careful seating and the poems and the songs, and the quiet oath renewed, and the sleeping children watched over in the dark, all of it moved at exactly the pace this world believed such things deserved to move, unhurried, attentive, generous with its own time, in a way that our own faster world sometimes forgets is even possible. Somewhere in that valley, more than 1,000 years removed from wherever you are lying right now, that hall still stands, in memory if nowhere else, its fire still glowing low and steady in the deep hours of a winter night that ended, eventually, the way all such nights do, in quiet and in rest, and in the simple, patient certainty that morning, whenever it finally arrived, would find the household warm, and fed, and safe, and ready, however slowly, to begin again. Let the fire in that hall be the last thing you carry with you tonight, banked low and glowing steady under its thin coat of ash, needing nothing more from anyone, asking nothing more of you either. You do not have to hold on to anything else. Let your own breathing slow the way the halls did. Let your own thoughts settle the way that valley settled under its blanket of undisturbed snow, and let yourself now, finally, rest. Sleep well, my friend. We have been somewhere warm tonight, somewhere far away and very cold outside its walls, and very, very warm within them, and I am glad, more than I can easily say, that you chose to spend this particular quiet evening there with me, in that far-off valley, beside that low, steady, patient fire, on a night that ended, as every good night eventually does, in warmth and in rest and in quiet, and in the kind of deep, unhurried sleep that a long, well-told story, offered slowly enough and warmly enough, can sometimes gently help along,